sunt aici, dar nu pot să pornesc.
Bună ziua, sunt Mila Malerău și vă spun bine ați venit la conferința cu genericul TAXCON'20, prima conferință internațională online cu tematică fiscală desfășurată în Republica Moldova. Conferința este organizată de Camera Americană de Comerț, AmCham Moldova, organizația pe care am onoarea și plăcerea să o reprezint. Scopul pe care ni l-am propus cu acest eveniment este unul cu adevărat rebel. Pe timp de pandemie, când majoritatea întrunirilor și deplasărilor sunt restricționate, ne-am propus să creăm o platformă de dialog și să întrunim în cadrul acestei platforme profesioniști fiscali din mediul de afaceri, din rândurile autorităților de stat, din mediul academic, mediul științific, din partea partenerilor de dezvoltare, din țara noastră, dar paralel să aducem Republica Moldova în vizorul profesioniștilor fiscali și din străinătate. Și eu cred că ne-a reușit acest lucru. Avem 17 speakeri pe agenda și avem peste 600 de participanți înregistrați la acest eveniment. Vreau să mulțumesc participanților pentru că v-ați conectat la acest eveniment. Noi avem foarte mari emoții, însă păstrăm siguranța că vom capta atenția dumneavoastră cu conținutul propus pentru această conferință și vă vom avea alături constant în următoarele 2 zile. Câteva cuvinte despre Camera Americană de Comerț sau AmCham Moldova, pentru acei care nu ne cunosc încă foarte bine, dar sper că vor rămâne aproape de noi după acest eveniment. Camera Americană de Comerț este o asociație a business-ului care la moment întrunește circa 140 de companii membre, iar misiunea esențială a acestei asociații este de a contribui la climatul de afaceri ca să fie mai propicii investițiilor. În cadrul Camerei Americane, de mai mulți ani este activ și funcțional Comitetul pe Fiscalitate. Acest comitet întrunind contabili șefi, directori financiari, auditori, consultanți în domeniul fiscal, pentru ca să asigure în permanent schimb de informații despre politicile fiscale sau despre aspecte importante ale administrării fiscale. Eu vreau foarte mult să le mulțumesc speakerilor pentru că au acceptat invitația să împărtășească cu participanții conferinței viziunile despre domeniile abordate în cadrul sesiunilor dedicate ale conferinței. Și nu în ultimul rând, eu vreau să mulțumesc companiilor membre AmCham care au fost de acord să sprijine financiar acest eveniment. Este vorba de compania PwC, de compania Deloitte, de compania Andersen, este vorba de asemenea despre compania App și nu în ultimul rând eu vreau să mulțumesc frumos pentru mediatizarea evenimentului partenerului nostru media, Monitor FiscamD. A venit și timpul să prezint moderatorii conferinței. Dan Manolescu, în trecut secretar de stat pe domeniul fiscal și vamal în cadrul Ministerului de Finanțe Publice din România, actualmente tax partner pentru Soter & Partners, dar și președintele Camerei Consultanților Fiscali din România. Maestru Dan te-aș numi eu, fiindcă înțeleg că orice discuție importantă pe tematică fiscală nu are loc fără prezența ta, Dan. Sper că ești conectat, ne vezi, ne auzi, vrem să-ți spunem bine ai venit și să te rugăm să ne saluți și tu pe noi.
Da, bună ziua, vă văd foarte bine. Mulțumesc mult pentru invitația de a participa în această conferință în calitate de moderator. Mă bucur că am reușit ca în cadrul acestei conferințe să avem ca participanți foarte mulți consultanți fiscali, membri ai Camerei Consultanților din România, pe care îi salut pe această ocazie și le mulțumesc că și-au luat din timpul lor pentru a participa la această conferință, care cu siguranță va aduce în atenție subiecte de larg interes, nu doar în ceea ce privește legislația specifică Moldovei sau specifică României, ci aspecte care țin de taxare internațională și de ce se întâmplă în această perioadă în legislația fiscală la nivel european și mondial, ca urmare a tuturor acestor provocări generate de criza COVID. Pe parcursul zilei de azi și de mâine voi avea plăcerea de a modera alături de Veronica Vragaleva, pe care o cunosc atât de mult și
Dan, îți mulțumesc frumos. Vreau și eu să o prezint pe moderatoarea alături de tine acestui eveniment. În trecut Veronica Vragaleva, acum Veronica Serețeanu. Veronica actualmente este colega mea în cadrul AmCham, în trecut secretar de stat pe domeniul fiscal și vamal în cadrul Ministerului Finanțelor din Republica Moldova. Eu nu cred că cunosc o altă persoană atât de pasionată de fiscalitate și de cercetare a politicilor fiscale, dar și atât de dornică de popularizare a politicilor fiscale sănătoase și oportune pentru țara noastră. Veronica a fost inițiatorul și promotorul acestui eveniment și sursa de inspirație și de energie pentru realizarea conferinței. Veronica, eu cu mare drag îți ofer microfonul și îți doresc multă baftă și rămân aici alături de tine.
Mulțumesc mult, Mila! În primul rând, conferința se va desfășura pe parcursul a 2 zile. Vorbim despre astăzi și mâine dimineață. Astăzi avem în discuție 2 secțiuni. Secțiunea care ține de armonizarea la directivele UE a TVA și accizelor și o altă secțiune specială care ține de consecințele fiscale ale pandemiei, ale COVID-ului în țările din Europa Centrală și de Est. Și acest al doilea panel special, secțiune specială, este coorganizată cu alte câteva AmCham-uri. O să vorbim mai mult despre asta atunci când ajungem nemijlocit la subiectul dat. În afară de aceasta, limba de desfășurare a evenimentului nostru este română. Totodată este asigurată traducerea sincronă în limba engleză și rusă. Pentru cei care ne privesc din Zoom, aceasta se face prin selectarea canalului corespunzător. Dacă doriți să ascultați în limba rusă, selectați rusa, în engleză engleza și dacă doriți să ascultați în română, selectați franceza. Cu părere de rău, Zoom-ul încă nu are opțiunea ca și alegere să o selectez pe cea în română. O secțiune va dura 90 de minute în mediu și între secțiunea 1 și cea specială va fi o scurtă pauză. În afară de aceasta, trebuie să atrag atenție că va avea loc o transmisiune live a evenimentului în limbile originare pe YouTube, pe canalul de YouTube al Camerei Americane de Comerț din Moldova. De asemenea, tot pe același canal va avea loc și o transmisiune curată în română, deci dublată curată în română, pentru cei care nu au înțelegerea tuturor celor 3 limbi care vor fi utilizate astăzi de către vorbitorii noștri. De asemenea, atât pe YouTube cât și în Zoom puteți să adresați întrebări către speakerii noștri. Acestea vor fi acordate nemijlocit dumnealor în cadrul rundelor dinăuntru secțiunilor, dar dumneavoastră sunteți liberi să le acordați pe parcursul întregii secțiuni. Noi le vom colecta împreună cu Dan și atunci când ajungem deja nemijlocit în faza de întrebări-răspunsuri, o să le abordăm. Acestea ar fi în linii mari principalele momente tehnice. Dacă sunt careva momente care ați mai vrea să le concretizați sau care credeți că ar trebui să le enunțăm, vă rog să ne ziceți numai decât. Acestea fiind spuse, cred că putem trece încetișor la lucru nemijlocit în cadrul conferinței și să începem cu prima secțiune în cadrul conferinței și anume armonizarea la directivele Uniunii Europene a TVA și accize. Subiectul dat este desigur unul extrem de important pentru noi ca și țară care am semnat acordul de asociere cu Uniunea Europeană, dar și pentru regiune per se, deoarece procesul de armonizare la directivele UE este unul continuu și cumva anumite provocări care pot fi discutate astăzi pot să fie ulterior extrapolate și asupra altor procese, unul la mână și doi la mână. Vorbind despre TVA și accize, sunt impozitele indirecte care sunt în continuă schimbare și indiferent dacă ești o țară deja membra Uniunii Europene sau ești o țară abia aspirantă să devii membra Uniunii Europene, cunoașterea în profunzime a mecanismelor de bază care stau în spatele acestora este una imperativă. Așa un subiect interesant, provocator și complicat nu putea fi discutat fără o echipă de paneliști pe măsură. O să încercăm în cele ce urmează să vă prezentăm care ar fi această echipă pe care am considerat-o noi că ar putea să reflecte în totală măsură subiectul dat pe interesul dumneavoastră. Vorbim în primul rând despre domnul Dorel Noroc, secretar de stat în cadrul Ministerului Finanțelor. Îl salutăm cu drag prezența dumnealui în secțiunea dată. În afară de aceasta vorbim despre Karl-Heinz Heilt. Karl este un specialist cu renume internațional în domeniul fiscal, cu o practică de peste 30 de ani, atât în autorități fiscale, în Big Four, dar și în companii private. În afară de aceasta, o avem în panel pe doamna Mariana Vizole. Doamna Mariana are și ea o experiență vastă în domeniul aplicării politicilor pe partea de TVA, activând în cadrul Ministerului Finanțelor Publice din România pe o perioadă de peste 17 ani. Acum dumneaei este consultant fiscal cu țara de origine de asemenea, adică fiind din România originară. În afară de aceasta vorbim despre Andy Logan. Andy este de asemenea un economist care a activat în cadrul Băncii Angliei pe o perioadă lungă de timp. Acum Andy este expert Oxford Economics. Și nu în ultimul rând aș vrea să vă prezint pe cel care este de fapt moderatorul panelului. Vorbim despre Daniel Angel. Daniel care este lider servicii fiscale și juridice în cadrul PwC, care activează în cadrul PwC din 1997 și a fost în echipa care a contribuit, de fapt și Mariana a fost în echipa care a contribuit la desfășurarea procesului de armonizare la directivele UE a TVA atunci când România a trecut prin acest proces. Daniel, ai cuvântul.
Mulțumesc mult, Veronica. Sper că mă auziți.
Da, e bine.
Perfect. Bună ziua, doamnelor și domnilor. Sunt onorat să fiu astăzi împreună cu dumneavoastră și cu un astfel de panel select, dintre care doi dintre cei mai dragi colegi pe care îi am, Mariana și Karl-Heinz, cu care am lucrat împreună în 2006-2007, atunci când am aderat la Uniunea Europeană. Și evident îi salut pe toți împreună cu domnul Dorel Noroc și Andy Logan. O să trec direct în tematica zilei de astăzi și a panelului despre care vă povestea Veronica mai devreme. Printr-o scurtă introducere veți vedea, vom vorbi de lucruri legate de procesul de armonizare al țărilor din Europa Centrală și de Est. Vom vorbi despre cum arată paleta modificărilor din zona de taxe și impozite indirecte, atât la nivel de Uniune Europeană cât și la nivel OECD. Și de asemenea, împreună cu domnul Dorel Noroc, vom afla cu ce se confruntă și care sunt provocările echipei de la Ministerul de Finanțe din Moldova. Și în ultimul rând, împreună cu Andy Logan, vom face o trecere în revistă a unor importante aspecte ale directivei privind accizele, cu focus important în zona de tutun și țigarete. Ok, acestea fiind zise, o să-i rog pe colegii organizatori să mă ajute cu prezentarea mea de astăzi și să intrăm direct în subiect. Veți vedea, prezentarea mea de astăzi este una în limba engleză, tocmai ca să încerc să acopăr cele două importante limbi din acest panel și în așa fel încât eu voi vorbi în limba română, dar slide-urile sunt în limba engleză. Astăzi, pe scurt, voi vorbi despre politica din zona TVA, zona fiscală, la nivel global și cum se vede agenda celor doi reglementatori extrem de importanți la nivel global, OECD și Comisia Europeană. Haideți să intrăm în primul slide. Așa cum spuneam, în deschiderea panelului de astăzi urmează să fac o prezentare a evoluțiilor din fiscalitate la nivel global. Și dacă mă ajutați cu următorul slide. Așa, perfect. Haideți să vedem împreună care este agenda politică și mediul de afaceri. Așa cum spunea colegul meu Karl-Heinz, cum putem să armonizăm cele două lumi. Trebuie să recunoaștem că actualul context politic este definit de tensiune. Astăzi vă voi oferi o prezentare a evoluțiilor în fiscalitate la nivel global în contextul celor mai importante modificări apărute în legislația privind TVA. Și un prim slide care începusem să vorbesc despre el era legat de cele două lumi, zona politică și zona de business. Și evident am văzut în ultimii ani că mediul politic a devenit din ce în ce mai protecționist și imprevizibil, nu doar în România, ci și la nivel mondial. Și impozitarea corectă a devenit o știre a primei pagini și evident fiecare măsură a încercat să ia adopte tot felul de soluții pentru a-și crește veniturile fiscale. În contextul pandemiei putem vorbi de o acalmie în care guvernele au încercat să adopte măsuri fiscale și economice pentru a limita impactul negativ asupra angajaților și afacerilor, dar sunt convins că zona de impozitare corectă și de substanță vor lua din nou avânt începând cu anul viitor. În mediul de afaceri, pe de altă parte, există o serie întreagă de provocări date de structura de business, fie că este vorba despre modelul de afaceri care intră o continuă schimbare, fie că e vorba de tehnologie. Și asta pentru că toate companiile încearcă să se adapteze la viteza schimbărilor tehnologice. Și mai ales, evident, în contextul actual. Și în cele din urmă ne punem întrebarea, noi contribuabilii suntem prinși între cele 2 luni de care vorbeam la început și gândindu-mă cum funcționează relația dintre autoritatea fiscală și contribuabil, am în minte această imagine pe care o vedeți, David și Goliat, micul contribuabil față în față cu atotputernicele autorități fiscale. Și dacă e să fac un remember, vă aduceți aminte, colegii din România, de operațiunea Iceberg și Tomis și, evident, și multe alte acțiuni pe care le-a avut ANAF. Dar, indiferent dacă vorbim despre taxe mai mari sau despre sisteme mai invazive, cum ar fost, spre exemplu, split TVA, implementate peste noapte, acestea, evident, lasă contribuabilul cu foarte puține opțiuni sau instrumente pentru a lupta împotriva sistemului. Mergând mai departe, vă voi spune câteva lucruri despre următorul slide. Dacă puteți să dați următorul slide, vom vorbi despre tendințele fiscale la nivel global. Vă mulțumesc. În care observăm, evident, aceste 4, să spun, tendințe majore, în care raportările devin din ce în ce mai numeroase, iar contribuabilii sunt sub presiune să dezvolte tot mai multe informații autorităților fiscale, în timp ce raportarea în timp real devine o realitate. Și mă refer, evident, aici la TVA. Spania, care deja are în jur de 3 miliarde de facturi și încarcă date undeva la 4 zile. Ungaria deja a trecut la real-time reporting și solicită datele încărcate zilnic. Și, evident, putem spune că acestea sunt greoaie. Totuși, autoritățile fiscale colectează, cum spuneam, din ce în ce mai multe informații și, evident, pe baza, folosind digitalizarea și platformele online, acestea comunică și mult mai ușor. În contextul muncii de acasă și al noii pandemii, a noi distanțări sociale, evident că toată zona de tehnologie și de digitalizare nu face altceva decât să fie mult mai accelerată. Sperăm ca și în România, ca stat membru, vom vedea lumina de la capătul tunelului și marea digitalizare, așa cum obișnuiam eu să-i spun proiectului cu Banca Mondială, care din păcate a fost stopat, și evoluția micii digitalizări, așa cum numesc eu Standard Audit File for Tax, vor prinde lumină începând de anul viitor. Sau măcar vor fi începute începând de anul viitor. Focusul deosebit pe controale, o altă tendință în care în această perioadă evident s-au lovit de dificultatea desfășurării acestora și au încercat să-și adapteze metodologie de control în zona online. În context global, însă, taxa pe valoare adăugată sau GST-ul în Statele Unite tinde să devină un impozit pe business, din păcate, pe lângă faptul că este un impozit pe consum. Și de ce spun acest lucru? Pentru că este o schimbare de paradigmă evidentă către impozitele indirecte, care au un procent foarte mare în bugetele diferitelor guverne și, evident, acestea încearcă să genereze venituri suplimentare prin inspecții fiscale agresive, formalități sporite sau noi sancțiuni care sunt adoptate, iar rambursarea în anumite state în continuare reprezintă un proces lent și laborios. Multe dintre problemele de astăzi au un caracter transfrontalier, o altă tendință, dar obiectivele factorilor de decizie, din păcate, sunt în continuare locale și nu sunt aliniate la nivel internațional. Interacțiunea dintre diferite taxe nu este luată în considerare. Frauda, spre exemplu, în domeniul TVA, se deplasează extrem de rapid la nivel transfrontalier, dar obiectivele factorilor de decizie sunt încă locale și nu sunt aliniate la nivel internațional. Măsuri precum Standard Audit File for Tax, Real-Time Reporting sau Split TVA, dacă ne aducem aminte de anul trecut sau de acum 2 ani, dacă sunt luate doar la nivel național, vor duce către o și mai mare lipsă de armonizare a sistemului de TVA și la mai multe raportări și costuri pentru companiile multinaționale și nu numai. În ultimul rând, o altă tendință extrem de actuală, există un accent intens pe impactul economiei digitale asupra veniturilor naționale. Dacă mergem mai departe, aș vrea să vă, pe următorul slide, să vă dau câteva detalii pe scurt din agenda celor doi mari reglementatori, OECD și Comisia Europeană. Vedeți cam care sunt cele mai importante subiecte de politică fiscală la nivel internațional și, în opinia mea, există trei, să spun, subiecte majore la nivel global, care conturează dezbaterea politică și fiscală în aceste zile. În primul și în primul rând, agenda digitală. În al doilea rând, frauda în domeniul TVA și renumitul raport pe care îl emite Comisia Europeană în mod regulat referitor la VAT Gap și vom vorbi mai despre acest lucru. Și în ultimul rând, reformele fiscale pe care le vedem în foarte multe state. În zona OECD, activitatea recentă se învârte în jurul a trei subiecte, dintre care două despre digitalizare, unul privind comerțul transfrontalier. Cele două lucrări emise pe zona digitală se concentrează în principal pe impozitarea business to consumer, pe baza principiului destinației și a înregistrărilor simplificate. Dar poate cea mai importantă lucrare OECD din ultima perioadă este faimosul BEPS, Base Erosion Profit Shifting, care are și o agendă privind taxarea indirectă, încercând o aliniere a celor două concepte de permanent establishment și de fixed establishment, interacțiunea dintre TVA și ajustările privind prețurile de transfer și, în ultimul rând, posibilitatea autorităților fiscale de a folosi ajustările privind country by country reporting, am închis calculatorul, country by country reporting în cadrul inspecțiilor de TVA. Cât privește măsurile la nivel UE, le vom vedea mai pe larg în slide-ul următor. Nu o să mai stau pe acest slide, vă rog să trecem la următorul slide. Și anume, voi vorbi foarte pe scurt de planul de acțiune al Uniunii Europene în materie de TVA. Poate cea mai importantă reformă din ultimul timp, care a început în 2016, la nivelul Uniunii Europene, este cuprinsă în planul de acțiune EU VAT Action Plan. Acesta cuprinzând 4 arii majore: pachetul e-commerce și cel pentru IMM-uri, măsurile de combatere a fraudei, de care am vorbit mai devreme, sistemul definitiv și regimul cotelor reduse. Pachetul privind comerțul electronic intră în vigoare gradual până în anul 2021, cu deja primele modificări de anul trecut privind noile simplificări privind serviciile electronice business to consumer, iar pachetul pentru IMM-uri urmărește reducerea obligațiilor administrative pentru acestea, pentru aceste IMM-uri care operează evident local și transfrontalier. Intenția fiind de a reduce costurile de conformitate cu un procent de 18%. Al doilea pilon, și anume VAT Gap sau decalajul de TVA. Așa cum spuneam, Comisia Europeană publică în mod regulat situația VAT Gap în Uniunea Europeană. Ultimul raport, chiar săptămâna trecută, din anul 2000, face referire la anul 2018. Din păcate, pentru al 6-a an consecutiv, România este campioana Uniunii Europene la deficitul de încasare a TVA. Deficit de încasare care de această dată a fost de 33,8% în 2018 și suntem urmați îndeaproape de Grecia cu 30% și Lituania cu 25,9%. Suma pe care România nu o încasează din TVA reprezintă aproximativ 6,4 miliarde de euro, care, pentru comparație, reprezintă circa 3% din PIB, echivalent cu deficitul bugetului consolidat din anul 2018, ca să vă dau un termen de comparație. Și asta deși România a încercat în numeroase rânduri să limiteze acest decalaj. Ultima dintre măsuri pe care sunt convins că o știți este vorba de split TVA, care a fost și anulat ca urmare a unui infringement. Cea mai recentă măsură însă la nivelul Uniunii Europene în scopul reducerii fraudei de TVA o constituie directiva privind taxarea inversă generalizată, pentru care statele membre pot implementa acest sistem dacă îndeplinesc evident condițiile de aplicare, cea mai importantă fiind legată de frauda carusel și de procentul de cel puțin 25%. Cu toate acestea, Cehia a obținut anul trecut decizia Consiliului Uniunii Europene să aplice acest sistem, cel mai probabil începând de anul viitor. Al treilea pilon, sistemul definitiv de TVA. Știm foarte bine, acest sistem introdus de aproape 30 de ani începe să gâfâie și practic a început să alimenteze această tendință nefavorabilă. Vedem, frauda a crescut vertiginos în anumite state și atunci Comisia Europeană urmărește să schimbe radical acest sistem intracomunitar de comerț cu bunuri și să-l înlocuiască cu sistemul bazat pe principiul destinației, asemănător cu ce se întâmplă în zona comerțului electronic, în care furnizorul aplică TVA din statul membru de consum. Acest nou sistem, evident, vine în două faze, cel legat de remediile rapide, în care și noi l-am aplicat cu o mică deviație de la început de ianuarie, cam cu o lună de la momentul în care ar fi trebuit să intre în vigoare, dar niciodată nimeni nu este perfect, evident. Și o a doua fază de lansare fiind undeva în anul 2022, 1 iulie, deși, sincer să fiu, eu am dubii că se poate realiza atât de repede. Și în ultimul rând, pe partea de cote de TVA, intenția Comisiei este de a permite statelor membre o libertate mai mare în ceea ce privește cotele de TVA reduse pe care statele membre le aplică. Dacă ar fi să mergem mai departe, perfect, la câteva dintre măsurile pe care le-au luat diferitele guverne și mă refer în mod special la Europa Centrală și de Est, pentru că este mult mai aproape de noi și de contextul nostru. Așa cum spuneam, după declanșarea crizei COVID, guvernele au adoptat măsuri fiscale și economice pentru a limita impactul negativ asupra angajaților și afacerilor, pentru a contribui la asigurarea lichidităților pentru companii deja afectate de instituirea stării de urgență. Măsurile, evident, au vizat în principal amânarea plății taxelor, rambursarea accelerată a TVA sau suspendarea inspecțiilor fiscale și, nu în ultimul rând, scutiri de taxe și impozite. Și avem foarte multe exemple. Am cuprins pe acest slide atât elemente și măsuri din zona de TVA, cu diferite implicații în anumite state, în zona de impozit pe profit și contribuții, zona de impozite pe salarii sau alte elemente, cum ar fi extinderi ale termenelor de implementare pentru SAFT în Polonia, o amnistie fiscală în România și în Bulgaria, dar sunt convins că nu o să intru în detalii, pentru că sunt convins că toți participanții la această conferință s-au lovit de aceste lucruri. Haideți să ajungem la următorul slide, și anume zona de concluzii. Dacă ne uităm la cadrul, să spunem, internațional fiscal, vedem că din ce în ce mai important este vorba de reforma administrațiilor fiscale. Evident, digitalizarea are un focus din ce în ce mai mare. Aș putea să spun, în loc de concluzii, digitalizare, digitalizare, digitalizare. Ne dorim acest lucru și în România. Am văzut deja programe legate de Standard Audit File for Tax în alte 12 state membre. În România înțeleg că lucrurile mai trenează și probabil că undeva anul viitor vom vedea și acest lucru. Spuneam la începutul prezentării mele, ne dorim revitalizarea programului cu Banca Mondială sau ceva asemănător. Sunt state precum Bulgaria, Lituania, Polonia, care au apelat fie la finanțări din zona Băncii Mondiale sau a Uniunii Europene și care cu succes au implementat astfel de reforme. Și un astfel de dialog pe care îl avem astăzi, și îl salut încă o dată pe domnul Dorel Noroc din partea Ministerului de Finanțe, un dialog între mediul de afaceri și autoritățile fiscale, este întotdeauna benefic. Și în ultimul rând, având în vedere contextul legat de pandemie și de deficitele majore pe care le-au înregistrat statele în această perioadă, inclusiv în zona fiscală, reimaginarea priorităților în acest context și relansarea economiei este extrem de importantă în această fază, mult mai importantă decât să vedem anul viitor creșteri de taxe și impozite pe care evident nu ni le dorim. Și de aceea digitalizarea și aportul acestea pe zona de colectare și într-adevăr de atenuare a evaziunii fiscale vor avea un cuvânt extrem de important și major în perioada care va urma. Vă mulțumesc foarte mult pentru timpul alocat și pentru prezența la această conferință. Și acum o să dau ștafeta către colegul meu, Karl-Heinz, pe care și Veronica l-a prezentat mai devreme. Karl-Heinz practică zona de politică fiscală de foarte mult timp, de aproape 30 de ani în zona.
Would like to briefly follow up on the great presentation of Daniel, just mentioning again that why is harmonization so important? Clearly, VAT is a tax on the final consumer collected by the business community. It has become one of the main revenue raisers for government, as Danielle mentioned. And at the same time, if you look back the last 50 years, it's a globally the fastest growing tax, because we have now over 160 countries in the world who operate a sort of VAT system. At the same time, business has been global too. So we have a lot of interactions now with global trade between different VAT systems, which of course is very, very important actually to have a sort of harmonization in order to foster global trade and to not have VAT as a trade barrier, but at the same time also to safeguard VAT revenues for the governments, because it's one of the main revenue raisers. So that was just a bit the starting point. Now, what are the challenges if we look at harmonization? Number one, I think nationally, we see that various VAT systems actually have different types of exemptions and different rates. And if you now look at putting this kind of, and has known tax culture or VAT culture, putting this into a broader context internationally or into the EU context means that actually having a history which has to be adapted now to a new set of rules. And if we look, for example, at the EU, we have a VAT directive. At the same time, we have 27 VAT systems, because the VAT directive quite often is actually, the regulations are quite often vague. It's a compromise with the unanimity principle of 27 member states, which then the member states have to adopt into national law. So if now a new country, if we look back in the accession in 2004, but also when Romania joined and Bulgaria 2007 and later Croatia as well, if new member states actually want to join the EU, they're joining a system where we have to say, well, there is a directive, but there is no perfect system as such. You can learn a lot from 27 national VAT systems. So there are good practices in there in various countries, like VAT grouping, other aspects, which I think as a new country you can pick up on, but it's not, it's a dream actually to say there's a one perfect VAT system in the EU, and let's focus on this. So I think Mariana might confirm later on that when Romania joined, looked all over the place to see what can be found. And if you look at the Romanian legislation, for example, it's a fantastic legislation, very close to the directive. But at the same time, of course, in Romania, the difficulty is always the application by the tax administration, which I'm sure Mariana might say something about it. So the VAT law as such and being close to the EU law is very, very important. But as I always say, the best law in the world is worth nothing if it's not applied the right way by the administration. So the administration plays, of course, also a very, very important role in actually applying the law correctly. And so now if I look back in the experience which we had on the challenges, clearly I think what is very, very important also from the business perspective to start the accession process as early as possible, because it takes time to actually get there, both for the government side, but also for the business community. I think it's very, very important to actually, as I said before, look at good practices which are around in other member states and see if they can be implemented based on the directive also into the national law, sort of with the culture, the tax culture is, the legal culture which is there. I think that's, from my perspective, something which I felt in the whole accession countries, accessions process which I've been involved, is very, very important to look at. At the same time, I think it is also very important, as Danielle mentioned, to consult actually with external stakeholders like the business community at an early with them to a certain extent, negotiated that within the accession treaties that they can, for example, keep certain exemptions, they can actually, how to say, keep certain rates. And that's, of course, is a complexity, I think, for the business community, because we have to operate now in 27 different member states, 27 different rates, 27 different exemptions sometimes. And I think that's something which is a challenge also now, as we see with the Commission, to harmonize actually these kind of things we see with rates. It's not possible politically. Exemptions, it's always critical. Well, they have been used often as a policy tool. Can we now tax it, for example? Can we question mark tax financial services? It's a big issue politically, but also possibly for the small man on the street to feel that they pay a new kind of tax, which they possibly at the moment pay already hiddenly without knowing. So there are all these kind of political aspects which are also play a big role into the accession challenges. And I think what I wanted to say as well, I think, is that yeah, it's a process which needs to be actually dealt with with various stakeholders at the same time. It's the legal aspects, the tax administration aspects, the business aspects. And if you would want to make it work for all parties involved, again, as I said before, Danielle mentioned it greatly, it's important really to travel together, to consult, to work together on this. So clearly what we are seeing now is, and you mentioned it, Danielle, before, I want to just, because I know that we are strict in time, just outline a bit on it as well. We have seen that we have a system at the moment, which actually in the EU, which actually is known for being complex and sensitive or open to fraud. And here the Commission, as you greatly outlined, Danielle, has already sort of taken some steps to see how it can be improved. And here the definitive regime proposal, for example, is on the table, still from the Commission side. But at the same time, I think that's what I wanted to give an outlook to the colleagues here. At the same time, we have seen member states taking national measures, for example, in technology. We have a Spanish SII reporting, as you greatly mentioned, Daniel, before. We have a split payment in Poland. We have a mandatory invoice in Italy. And all of this actually feels like they're all totally different measures going in diverse directions. And it feels like the borders, which 1993 have been physically taken away, are now going to be put in place technology-wise. And so there is a big issue at the moment that the current system doesn't work well. Member states actually take national measures to protect the system, or to actually fight against fraud. And all of this adds additional complication for all of us who operate across the 27 member states. So I think, therefore, what we will see in future, and the Commission has published an action plan on tax mid of July, where 25 initiatives have been mentioned. Out of these 25, we have 15 which are related to VAT, and one big important topic for the Commission going forward will also be the role of technology. What can technology do to improve the system, and what can it not do? So, as with all of us in our current life, being in the middle of a digital storm, whatever we do, technology plays a big role. It will be also in the center and in the forefront of the development of a future VAT system. And that's what will be very interesting now to actually see in the next couple of months and years, how far we can come to a more consistent approach. As I mentioned, we have different measures by member states. Can we come to a more consistent technology approach for the EU in order to make things more simpler? Because if new member states are going to join now and are joining this kind of fragmented way of dealing with things, it's of course an issue and is a further complication for them. So I think that's in short a bit what I wanted to share, of not only on the accession side of things and the challenges there, but also where our VAT system in the EU might go in the years to come. And there again, as I mentioned, technology will play a very, very important role. Apologies, I had no presentation. Some of you know I broke my middle hand bone, so I'm actually with my right hand in a cast. But I hope I could give you a good flavor of challenges on harmonization, but also an outlook what will come if in future. And with this, I'm open for questions as we go along our panel. Thank you so much, Danielle. I'll pass it back on to you.
Thank you very much, Karl-Heinz. I hope you are you can hear me. You did very well, like always, even with the small injury on the hand. So no worries, everything was perfect and in line with the expectations. And like you mentioned, simplification in VAT world means always complications. So from that perspective, I'm sure we all of us witnessed at a point in time the same effect. Mergând mai departe, thank you, Karl-Heinz. Mergând mai departe, aș vrea să o rog pe doamna Vizoli, doamna Mariana Vizoli, pe care sunt convins că foarte multă lume o cunoaște. Cu doamna Vizoli am început și împreună cu Karl-Heinz, cum spuneam la început, am început parcursul legat de armonizarea legislației de TVA în România. Și așa cum spunea și Karl-Heinz, România are o legislație extrem de bună în zona de TVA, dar întotdeauna sau din când în când aplicarea lasă de dorit. Și acum aș vrea să o rog pe doamna Vizoli. Eu întotdeauna îi spun mama TVA-ului din România, să ne spună câteva cuvinte legate de provocările din România în materie de TVA. Doamna Vizoli? Să vedem dacă se poate și conecta.
Mariana, pornește, te rog, sonorul, că nu te auzim.
Era pe mut.
Da.
Gata.
Da. Mulțumesc, Daniel. Bună ziua tuturor participanților la această conferință. Cred că sunt informații foarte interesante pe care pot să le afle de la specialiști de marcă. Îl salut și pe Karl-Heinz, un vechi prieten cu care m-am tot reîntâlnit pe all over the world, inclusiv la Tokyo, la foarte multe conferințe legate de TVA. Prezentarea mea este destul de succintă. Sigur că m-am axat pe experiența României în ce privește aderarea. Da, puteți să dați la slide-ul următor, vă rog. Da, în aceste slide-uri veți găsi doar câteva idei, pentru că provocările aderării sunt atât de numeroase încât e greu să le enumeri în câteva slide-uri. Cu ce aș vrea să încep este că România a luat o decizie înțeleaptă înainte de aderare cu vreo 2 ani, de fapt nu, cu vreo 4 ani așa, am solicitat un program de asistență pentru transpunerea directivei europene. Pentru că, așa cum spunea și Karl-Heinz, directivele sunt dificil de înțeles, uneori au prevederi foarte vagi. Mă gândesc aici, îmi vine așa un exemplu în minte, transferul de active. O să găsiți în directivă câteva cuvinte despre transferul de active și fără experiența altui stat membru nu prea știi ce să prevezi în legislația ta națională. Și sunt multe alte lucruri în directiva de TVA la care trebuie să preiei din experiența altor state membre. Motiv pentru care noi am solicitat acel program de asistență. A durat destul de mult, deci specialiștii din Pricewaterhouse România împreună cu cei din Belgia, specialiștii de acolo care au câștigat licitația, au stat circa 1 an și jumătate în România până când am terminat toată legislația, inclusiv actele normative subsecvente, norme, ordine ale ministrului. Deci a fost un program foarte bine pus la punct pentru a transpune directiva de TVA, care, așa cum vedeți în acest slide, este directiva 112. Sigur, sunt multe alte directive subsecvente, dar aceasta e directiva de bază care stabilește sistemul comun de TVA pe care îl aplică statele membre. După transpunerea directivei de TVA în legislația națională, noi am mai solicitat încă un program de asistență pentru diseminare. Adică nu este suficient să ai o legislație bună, trebuie să înveți și organele fiscale și operatorii economici cum să aplice legislația respectivă. Drept pentru care, în anul 2008, după aderare, 1 an de zile am avut acest program de diseminare în care am ținut conferințe în toată România. Au fost circa 12 conferințe, cam una pe lună, așa, în localități diferite. Daniel a fost de multe ori alături de mine la aceste conferințe, pentru ca, așa cum vă spuneam, pe lângă o legislație bună, să existe și persoane care să înțeleagă modul de aplicare a legislației respective. Da, într-adevăr, transpunerea directivelor este foarte importantă pentru că asigură o aplicare unitară, este o condiție impusă de aderare, transpunerea directivelor care nu se aplică ca atare, trebuie transpuse față de regulamente care se aplică ca atare și scopul lor este, scopul adaptării legislației înainte de aderare este să elimine prevederile neconforme cu directiva. Mai ales la scutiri, există anumite scutiri pentru că scutirile sunt de strictă interpretare. Nu poți să ai mai multe scutiri decât cele care sunt prevăzute de directivă, decât cu derogări pe care le obții înainte de aderare, dar este destul de dificil, în afară de transportul internațional de persoane, unde toate statele membre care au solicitat au obținut derogare. În rest, doar statele membre vechi care au format Uniunea Europeană mai au prevederi care mai derogă de la scutirile de TVA. Mai departe, vă rog, următorul slide. Încă un element important de care trebuie să țină cont un stat care aderă la Uniunea Europeană este jurisprudența Curții de Justiție a Uniunii Europene, pentru că interpretarea dată de Curtea de Justiție Europeană directivei de TVA este obligatorie în toate statele membre. Efectul deciziilor este retroactiv, dar de subliniat că nu pot fi aplicate deciziile curții decât pentru legislația care este în vigoare după aderare. Ce a fost valabil înainte de aderare rămâne supus doar legislației naționale. Și acum să luăm câteva exemple dintre cele mai importante elemente care... slide-ul următor, vă rog. Care sunt principalele modificări, enumerând, așa cum vă spuneam, numai câteva, după aderarea României la Uniunea Europeană, respectiv dacă Moldova va adera la Uniunea Europeană, probabil că va trece prin același proces. Acum, deja și Daniel și Karl-Heinz au vorbit despre regimul definitiv de TVA. Vedeți că la noi, sigur, la momentul aderării, exportul și importul de bunuri și către state membre a fost înlocuit cu livrarea intracomunitară și cu achiziția intracomunitară. Au dispărut granițele naționale, au fost introduse noi obligații declarative. În locul declarației noi avem acum declarația pentru operațiuni recapitulativă, pentru acest regim tranzitoriu care este numit acum, livrările și achizițiile intracomunitare de bunuri. Slide-ul următor, vă rog. Deci aceasta este schema unei livrări intracomunitare atunci când, de exemplu, din România se transportă bunuri în Ungaria către un alt stat membru, fiind vândute unui client. Aceasta este o livrare intracomunitară de bunuri care în prezent este scutită de TVA de directivă, fiind impozabilă achiziția intracomunitară în celălalt stat membru, lucru care probabil după regimul definitiv nu se va mai întâmpla. Slide-ul următor. Și operațiunea în oglindă, achiziția intracomunitară, de fapt este cea datorită căreia se dorește implementarea cât mai rapidă a regimului definitiv, pentru că, într-adevăr, achiziția intracomunitară de bunuri a dat naștere fraudei de tip missing trader, pentru că înainte de aderare, pentru achiziția de bunuri dintr-un alt stat, plăteai TVA în vamă. Un TVA care se plătea efectiv, după care se deducea. În timp ce, după aderare, la achiziția intracomunitară de bunuri, un plătitor de TVA aplică doar o taxare inversă, fără să facă plată efective. Acesta este motivul pentru care se dorește înlocuirea acestui regim. În ce privește prestările de servicii, aici nu se întrevăd modificări, nu există proiecte ale Uniunii Europene de modificare ale actualelor prevederi din directivă. Sunt prevederi generale în relația cu prestările de servicii către persoane impozabile, care sunt considerate neimpozabile în statul în care e stabilit prestatorul și impozabile în statul în care e stabilit beneficiarul, și în momentul în care serviciile sunt facturate pe relația B2C, adică către persoane neimpozabile, atunci se merge pe regula de impozitare la locul unde e stabilit prestatorul. Sigur, de la aceste reguli generale există o serie de excepții care sunt prevăzute de directivă și de asemenea de legislația națională, fără să intru în detalii mai departe. În ce privește dreptul de deducere, am vrut să subliniez că noi am avut probleme pentru că în directiva de TVA prevederile referitoare la dreptul de deducere sunt foarte generale. Nu sunt tratate cazurile de fraudă, cazul în care nu e realizată o activitate economică, în cazul în care nu sunt deplinite condițiile de formă privind deducerea, motiv pentru care încetul cu încetul în legislația fiscală din România au fost cuprinse foarte multe decizii ale Curții de Justiție Europene, tocmai pentru a completa cadrul legal național cu interpretarea dată de Curtea de Justiție, lucru pe care îl recomand cu căldură și în cazul în care Moldova va adera la Uniunea Europeană, tocmai pentru a asigura un cadru legal predictibil și mediului de afaceri, dar și organelor de inspecție fiscală. Alte obligații pe care le-a avut România la data aderării și care, sigur, o să aibă un ușor impact bugetar, nu foarte mare, este implementarea acestor directive este obligatorie. Aveți obligația să rambursați TVA-ul atunci când de pe teritoriul național se fac achiziții de bunuri sau servicii de persoane care sunt nestabilite în Moldova, dar sunt persoane impozabile. Din fericire, la persoanele nestabilite în Uniunea Europeană, directiva a 13-a oferă posibilitatea de a acorda această facilitate numai în cazul în care și statele respective ne acordă nouă rambursări de TVA. Deci, în prezent nu rambursăm decât către vreo 4 state nemembre ale Uniunii Europene. Pentru statele membre, în schimb, e obligatoriu să faceți aceste rambursări. Da, următorul slide. O altă provocare care nouă chiar ne-a dat mult de lucru a fost ajustarea pentru bunuri de capital. Noi nu am avut înainte de aderare prevederi referitoare la ajustări privind bunuri de capital. Directiva de TVA este foarte generală și din acest motiv chiar am avut noroc cu experiența celor care ne-au consiliat în cadrul programului de asistență, pentru că au venit cu experiența statelor membre în ce privește ajustarea TVA-ului, care este o materie destul de dificilă. Puteți să vă gândiți de asemenea la sistemul opțional privind plata TVA la încasare. Este o temă care este mai ales lansată de oamenii politici care înțeleg puțin altfel exigibilitatea TVA-ului la încasare. Directiva de TVA, în schimb, are niște prevederi care restrâng, să zicem, posibilitatea de a extinde această prevedere astfel încât o persoană care aplică acest TVA la încasare, chiar dacă colectează numai atunci când încasează, cel care cumpără de la el deduce doar dacă plătește. Adică este o măsură de stimulare, să zicem așa, a plăților în economia națională. Un alt regim la care puteți să vă gândiți care este opțional, pentru că directiva prevede și multe opțiuni. Este vorba despre regimul special pentru mici agricultori. Noi l-am introdus doar în 2017. Dacă considerați că este un regim care se potrivește Moldovei, puteți să vă gândiți și să vă inspirați din experiența noastră în ce privește implementarea acestui regim. Am mai pus pe acest slide tot așa din elementele care mi s-au părut importante, facturarea, pentru că și în ce privește facturarea, noi am avut probleme deosebite la aderare. România, înainte de aderare, avea un document tipizat, obligatoriu, cu niște informații care trebuiau neapărat să figureze în factură, pentru că altfel beneficiarul nu avea drept de deducere. Ori, după aderare, ne-am dat seama că directiva de TVA nu mai impune un formular obligatoriu, ci impune doar niște informații minimale în factură. De asemenea, este permisă facturarea electronică, transmiterea electronică a facturilor. Deci, la toate aspectele legate de facturare sunt de asemenea importante și sunt un capitol important din directiva de TVA. Cred că am ajuns la finalul acestei prezentări. Sigur, am trecut în revistă, așa cum spuneam, doar câteva dintre cele mai importante probleme cu care România s-a confruntat în ce privește aderarea la Uniunea Europeană. Nu te aud, Daniel.
Mariana, până revine Daniel, mulțumim frumos pentru prezentarea extrem de interesantă. Daniel?
Eram pe mut, cred.
Ok. Hai,
mulțumim foarte mult, doamna Vidoli. Mi-aduc aminte cu plăcere de perioadele în care călătoream prin țară și am avut cele două programe, primul de transpunere și al doilea de educare în zona contribuabilor și a inspecțiilor fiscale, și sunt convins că colegii din Moldova au fost extrem de atenți, pentru că lecțiile tranziției către noul sistem european nu sunt foarte ușoare. Și atunci sunt convins că întotdeauna ne putem baza pe experiența unui alt stat membru, așa cum spuneați dumneavoastră, care a fost mai greu sau mai puțin încercat din acest punct de vedere. Pentru a merge mai departe, o să vreau să le spun celor care se uită astăzi la noi că vom lua și întrebări la finalul discursurilor și mai sunt doi speakeri în panel. I'm going to switch to English in order to give the stick to Andy Logan. Andy, which is part of Oxford Economics, he's going to speak about excise and the excise directives on a very particular and important subject and focus on the tobacco industry. Andy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much and welcome everybody. Could you put my slides up, please? If that's possible. And could you go to the next one? Thank you very much. So I'm going to begin by discussing why the EU introduced its excise regime, its common minimum excise regime. I'm then going to go on to talk about the directive on tobacco, and I'm going to talk about the experience of some of the other countries that have accessed the EU and their experience of joining, and what happened to them when they had to meet one of the provisions of the directive. And I'm going to finish with perhaps what's going on now, which is a debate about within the EU as to how you should deal with excise taxation on e-cigarettes and heated tobacco products. So that's live, and that's kind of now what people are talking about. So if I could perhaps start with why did the EU want to, why do they want to have a uniform excise duty regime? Why did they want, what products was it levied on? So the products it's levied on, you can see down the left-hand side if you can read English. It's alcohols, and by that we mean beer, wine and spirits. It's manufactured tobacco products, cigarettes, cigars, cigarillos, and other smoking products, and it's a variety of energy products. Why did it seek to implement a sort of duty regime? Well, that is because it wanted to harmonise the structures so as not to distort competition between countries as to or products as to whether excise duty or whether they should make choices about the products that they choose or import different countries' products depending on the excise duty rate. Now, there's big questions as to whether they've actually achieved that, as in there's lots of people in the alcohol industry that complain about the fact that the tax on the excise duty on their drink is on the alcohol in their excise duty on their drink is different from that in other drinks. So typically you find people in the spirits industry complaining about how much excise duty the alcohol in the drink is charged on relative to that in beer and to a lesser extent wine. So you'll find that, but I doubt anyone goes into a bar or makes their choice as to what they're going to drink based on the excise duty. But potentially you might think about, you might think that where's the highest excise duty and how can I pay less excise duty? The sort of perhaps more interesting is the issue of sort of tobacco, whether people downtrade out of sort of manufactured cigarettes into sort of roll your own type tobacco because of price differentials that reflect excise differentials. So what we have in the EU is basically minimum provisions across the excise duty. They are there to make sure that the internal market functions. They are there to make sure the taxes are neutral, i.e. people do not make choices as to what product they're buying and where they're buying from based on the excise duty rate. That's the aim anyway. So turning my attention to tobacco products. So the EU directive on tobacco is basically a minimum directive. So you have to be compliant. It's not a maximum directive. It's not an average directive. It is what you must be above these standards. And some of them are more biting than others. It grew out of the fact that when the EU got set up, different countries had a different preference for ad valorem versus specific taxation. So they had to come to some kind of compromise. And the compromise was that you have to have both parts of your tax, both a specific part and an ad valorem part to cigarette taxation. Over time, most countries, not all, Italy possibly being a slight exception, or at least being quite sluggish in its movement, most countries have increased their reliance on the specific component and decreased their reliance on the ad valorem component. But perhaps the most, the specific component, just to explain, is a certain proportion across all cigarettes. It's a fixed amount charged in euros, and that you must be above that minimum that they charge. The ad valorem is expressed as a percentage of the retail selling price. So you must also be above the retail selling price, but that is set in a percentage terms and therefore is more specific to the economy. The big issue about accession is that the specific that you must have a minimum excise charge of 90 euros per 1,000 cigarettes. Now, to give an indication of where Moldova is now, they're currently about 36 euros per 1,000 cigarettes. So by the time that they want to make their adjustment, in 2025, it's obviously got to go up by 54 euros. Just see, doing some quick maths. So if I could turn to the next slide, if that's possible. So as I said, Moldova has decided in 2014 that it wants to meet the minimum of 90 euros per cigarettes. And that's going to have quite a large impact on how much excise duties are going to have to rise. So you can see in the chart that between 2010 and 2014, excise duties in Moldova on cigarettes went up by about 1.8 euros each year. In the last, from 2015 to 2020, they've gone up by about 4 euros a year. But to get to this target of 90, they're going to have to go up by 10.8 euros each year. Now, that's going to have a very large impact on the affordability of cigarettes within Moldova. So currently, on average, for most people, a packet of cigarettes is about 18% of the average person's disposable income. That's relatively high relative to some of the other countries. So, for example, Romania is about 17%, Serbia and Poland at about 15%, Russia and Lithuania at 11%, Belarus at 10%, and Germany and Greece at about 9%. But it's quite high. But that's quite high at the moment. But if they're going to increase it by 10 euros each year, you're going to see a very large decline in the affordability of cigarettes. Now, some people might think that's a good thing, particularly if they're with the health lobby, but it will come with some negative side effects if you put up excise duty and you put up price to this time scale. Firstly, I think you will see it incentivize cross-border movement. So people will go across the borders to purchase lower price cigarettes. So, for example, the Eurasian Economic Union has a much lower target in excise rates. So cigarettes will be cheaper there. It will also incentivize the growth of the illicit market. Now, both those things are a negative for the Moldovan Treasury, the Moldovan Ministry of Finance, because at the moment, cigarettes and tobacco more generally is providing quite a lot of revenue. So in 2019, 7% of the state budget in Moldova came from tobacco. Looking at excise duty until 32% of excise duty came from tobacco. So what we might see, what's important is that Moldova doesn't undermine those revenues that are coming to the government with the hope of getting to this 90% target that it's self-imposed. Moldova does have the option of delaying that speed of adjustment. So there is you can delay that or get there more slowly. And that, to my mind, would be probably a sensible option. Could I go to the next slide? I've spoken about the impact of very rapid adjustment to meet the 90 euros minimum excise duty on cigarettes. And some of the accession countries here, you can see the impact that joining the EU had on their cigarette markets. And I always think it's very interesting to look at the impact or how quickly some of the accession countries were forced to get to this minimum relative to some of the countries that had been a member for such a long time. So in this slide, we have divided some of the newer members of the EU, Latvia, Lithuania, Bulgaria, and Romania, versus some of the older members, Spain, Greece, and Portugal. Now, the ones on the left were given a very short time period to get to the 90 euros minimum. The ones on the right have had a very long time period. So they've taken, the ones on the right, Spain, Greece, and Portugal, have taken much longer, therefore had much lower increases in excise duty. Now, what does that mean? I think that means for me, and you can see in the impact on the illicit market, if you increase your excise duties very rapidly to get to this 90% minimum threshold, you will see a lot of distortion in your cigarette market. You will probably see the growth of the illicit market, and you will probably see the growth of cross-border shopping. I think some of the longer members have been very fortunate in the fact that because they've taken much lower time to get there and increased their excise duties much less rapidly, their illicit markets have grown much slower, if grown at all. So it's kind of interesting, and I think probably unfair from my perspective that some of the more long-term members have had so much time to get to the 90 euros threshold, whereas some of the accession countries have been forced to get there very rapidly, and that's had a very negative impact on the sort of the scale of the illicit market in cigarettes, and I'm sure cross-border shopping too. Could we go to the next slide, please? One of the big issues that the EU is debating at the moment is what are called novel tobacco products. Now, at the moment, and that for me means e-cigarettes, heated tobacco products, and there's obviously a lot of debate about are they good relative to cigarettes, in terms of health terms. They're new, they're developing all the time. New products are coming online. So what you see at the moment is that some countries within the EU do tax them, do levy excise duty on them, and others don't. And there's also there's large differences in the way that those, what is the tax base? What part of an e-cigarette should you be taxing? So recently, this year in 2020, the member states have gone to the Commission and asked for they've asked them to review the treatment of e-cigarettes and heated tobacco products, whether they should be included in the directive, whether there should be a uniform minimum excise rate, and if so, what should that be levied on? There is, as lots of these products are very new, the debate is still sort of very much ongoing and live. So you could, and there are different views. There is no great consensus across a number of aspects. So perhaps some of the easiest ones to pick on are obviously the health benefits. Are e-cigarettes and are heated tobacco products less risky than normal tobacco products, cigarettes, cigarillos, cigars, etc.? Do they help people leave or sort of cease smoking, or are they a sort of what's called a gateway? Do lots of youngsters start with e-cigarettes and then move on to tobacco, move on to the real thing? So there is a debate over that, and there's no consensus, and I'm sure it's different for different people. But at the moment, we have lots of different member states applying different rules, charging different amounts, and some of them don't charge anything at all. So the countries have gone to the European Commission and asked them to form a view. It's hoped that they will take a holistic approach and very much go through those issues to the extent about the health benefits, about whether it's a gateway, whether it helps people come off tobacco. So there's a large debate. If you asked me, my company are a great fan of specific taxation rather than ad valorem. So if you ask me, we would vote for specific taxes rather than an ad valorem approach. We would vote for lower taxation than is applicable on manufactured cigarettes. That in the belief that these products help people come off tobacco, so there's less of a health risk. So it's helpful to people when they try to cease tobacco. And we'd also vote for them to be implemented over a long time period. That's again about sort of illicit market and cross-border shopping type exercises. So I've hoped I have shown you that rapid convergence with the 90% threshold has caused lots of disturbance in EU countries, or those countries wanting to join the EU cigarette markets. And I hope I've shown you there is an intense debate, and let's hope the debate plays out in full about e-cigarettes, about heated tobacco products, and what the EU is going to decide about that. So at that point, I'll stop and hand back to Danielle.
Thank you, Andy. Hope that everybody's hearing me. Interesting and challenging world for excise, especially on the tobacco, and definitely the most easiest outcome is that things may get worse in terms of taxation of cigarettes in Moldova, and you may expect of threshold increase. Având în vedere aceste elemente pe care tocmai le-a menționat și Andy, cred că este un bun prilej să îi dăm cuvântul domnului secretar de stat Dorel Noroc din cadrul Ministerului de Finanțe din Republica Moldova să ne spună câteva cuvinte legate de lucrurile și perspectivele armonizării legislației de taxe și impozite indirecte și cum vede dumnealui acest program în Moldova. Domnul Noroc.
Dacă mi este permis, până intră domnul Noroc, înțeleg că avem o problemă tehnică, vă încurajez să adresați întrebări la secțiunea de Q&A. După prezentarea domnului Noroc, sper să putem să răspundem la cât mai multe dintre acestea. Deja avem adresate o serie de întrebări pe care probabil le vedeți și noastră, însă cred că vom avea timp pentru mai multe întrebări, așa că vă rog să le scrieți la acea secțiune. Iată că mai apar, mulțumesc mult. Scuze pentru intervenție. Domnule Noroc, vă rog.
Bună ziua! Se aude?
Da?
Da, vă mulțumesc mult. Eu am ascultat cu mare plăcere și interes toate prezentările. Pe multe concluzii mă regăsesc întru totul legate de schimbări, procese de digitalizare, legate de noi abordări pe care trebuie să le avem în situația pandemică, dar și post-pandemică. Eu aș spune și mai mult, eu cred că experiența Moldovei, noi care o avem, o să demonstreze că intervențiile în economie sunt mult mai eficiente prin subvenționări directe decât prin facilități fiscale. Acele aspecte legate de comunicarea permanentă cu mediul de afaceri, prin care să simți conexiunea de fiecare dată cu ceea ce se întâmplă în economie, sunt concluzii pe care le împărtășesc cu totul. Am reușit, din informațiile pe care le-ați prezentat, cred că se economisesc câteva luni sau ani de cercetări ca să ajung la aceste concluzii pe care le-ați făcut. Este extrem de utilă concluzia că atunci când faci armonizarea, trebuie să te asiguri că contribuabilii, clienții tăi, sunt gata și sunt informați cum să aplice aceste noi reglementări, nu doar să ne oprim la o simplă modificare de legislație, sunt chestii extrem de importante și la nivel de autorități trebuie foarte bine conștientizate. Și în prezentarea mea o să vedem, am văzut și în prezentarea colegilor, că cele mai mari provocări sunt legate de discutiri și de rate și aceasta este și provocarea cea mai mare pentru Republica Moldova. O să vedem în continuare. Uniunea Europeană este un fenomen unic, asta o recunosc toți, chiar dacă are posibil un cadru legal mai greoi ca să acopere toate statele, totuși el este un fenomen unic care a asigurat o creștere a fluxurilor economice și respectiv o dezvoltare a țărilor membri Uniunii Europene. Dacă este posibil să schimbăm următoarele slide-uri. Armonizarea legislației. Pentru noi ne punem întrebarea dacă este un angajament sau o necesitate. Angajamentul asigur că este, pentru că avem acordul de asociere în care ne-am angajat în mod treptat până în anul 2025 să ajungem să aproximăm legislația cu directivele Uniunii Europene. Armonizarea reprezintă și o necesitate. Este important ca economia Republicii Moldova, pe lângă faptul că au loc procesele de globalizare în care foarte rapid afacerile trec dintr-o țară în alta, au loc investiții masive, fluxuri financiare tot mai multe. Este important că atunci când vine un investitor să aibă siguranța că are o legislație pe care poate deja o cunoaște, o legislație care este întocmai cu directivele Uniunii Europene și are siguranța, tratamentul său fiscal este aplicat unul echitabil și corect. Dacă este rugăminte să schimbăm următorul slide. Spuneam că cele mai importante aspecte în procesul de armonizare este vizat de TVA și accize. Aceste impozite s-a menționat că au o pondere semnificativă în veniturile bugetare, sunt extrem de importante pentru a finanța cheltuielile bugetare. În Republica Moldova, aceste venituri sunt și mai importante. Practic, sistemul fiscal din Republica Moldova sau veniturile bugetare este bazat pe încasările din TVA și accize. Observăm că cu toate că a scăzut ca pondere în PIB încasările, totuși în veniturile bugetului public național, 32% sunt din taxa pe valoare adăugată. O sumă extrem de mare, de ce este important foarte atent în modificări ce ține de TVA, pentru că pot să afecteze inclusiv sustenabilitatea bugetară a țării. În ultima perioadă de timp au fost făcute câteva modificări, da, vă rog la slide-ul următor, au fost făcute câteva modificări în legislația fiscală. Aceste modificări au fost inspirate inclusiv în special din Directiva 112 și mă refer la aplicarea TVA pentru serviciile electronice prestate de agenți economici nerezidenți către populație, normă ce a intrat în vigoare de la 1 aprilie 2020. Pe lângă faptul că încasăm bani suplimentari, ne asigurăm că toți cei care prestează servicii în Republica Moldova către populație sunt în același regim, adică achită taxa pe valoare adăugată. 2. Am început să aplicăm sistemul de taxare inversă pentru agenții economici insolvabili, fiind un instrument de luptă împotriva fraudelor de aspectele de TVA, pentru că cumpărătorul își deduce suma TVA, dar vânzătorul nu achită. Reducerea cotei TVA pentru sectorul Horeca de la 20 la 15%. Cunoaștem că în multe țări, inclusiv și în România, această cotă este una și mai mică. Din posibilitățile bugetare s-a ajuns la concluzia să fie aplicat începând cu 1 mai 15%. Și un ultim moment foarte important, o reformă pe care a început în perioada de criză pandemică, implementarea programului de rambursare TVA. Republica Moldova, pe parcursul mai multor ani, nu a rambursat TVA-ul, cu excepția livrărilor către export, investiții capitale și câteva livrări, cum ar fi lapte și pâine, spre exemplu. În alte situații nu a avut loc rambursare de TVA. Pe parcursul, începând cu anii 2010, s-au acumulat sume importante de TVA. Am identificat un mecanism destul de rațional, în care noi rambursăm suma TVA-ului, dar în limita impozitelor salariale achitate. Ceea ce înseamnă că, în primul rând, rambursarea are loc treptat și este sustenabilă pentru buget. 2. Rambursăm cei care sunt onești cu statul, care achită impozite salariale în mărime deplină. Practic, mărimea rambursării este mai mare acolo unde există salarii achitate în mod legal. Ce ține de accize, vedem aici o evoluție a încasărilor din accize pentru produsele din tutun, produse petroliere și produse alcoolice. Ca urmare a majorării cotelor destul de semnificative pentru produsele petroliere, practic 9-10% anual, și la tutun vedem o creștere destul de semnificativă pe aceste încasări. Eu cred că Republica Moldova poate fi un caz de studiu de succes în creșterea cotelor la produsele din tutun. Practic observăm că din 2014 până în 2017 s-a reușit dublarea încasărilor de la aproximativ 1 miliard de lei la 2 miliarde de lei. O creștere destul de esențială pe acest domeniu. În continuare, o modificare făcută recent și destul de ambițioasă și îndrăzneață, aș spune eu, a fost introduse cote destul de mari pentru tutunul, pentru dispozitivele de încălzire așa numite IQOS și pentru tutunul tăiat fin destinat rulării în țigarete. vedem că în 2019 a fost introdusă o cotă de 610 per 1000 de bucăți. Este practic cota minimă pentru toate țigaretele. În 2019, în prima parte a anului, erau 143 de lei per kilogram. Aceste țigări au fost luată decizia să fie taxate cu un acciz mult mai mare. Asemenea, și tutunul destinat rulării a fost o creștere de la 143 de lei la 1000 de lei kilogram. Dacă să comparăm cu minima Uniunii Europene, s-a expus în prezentările anterioare, în slide-ul următor, vă rog. Aici este o evoluție a cotelor accizelor la țigări din 2008 și vedem că dacă în 2008-2013 accentul a fost pus pe cota de valori, începând cu 2013 accentul a fost pus pe suma fixă. Am văzut și că domnul Andy recomandă accentul pe suma fixă, ceea ce asigură încasări mai durabile în timp și asta s-a văzut și din informația ce ține de încasări, practic dublarea încasărilor într-o perioadă foarte scurtă de timp. Următorul slide, vă rog. Aici ce spuneam, diferența între accizul minim la țigări. În 2015, 15 euro, în 2020 deja am ajuns la 36 de euro. Este o diferență mare până ajunge la 90 de euro, dar sunt anumite limitări legate de parametri economici ai Moldovei și o să exemplific mai târziu. Am văzut și acel slide foarte informațional cu ritmul de creștere a țigărilor și cât trebuie să creștem în continuare. Până în anul 2025 ar trebui să ajungem la 90 de euro, dar având în vedere parametrii economici ai Moldovei, nivelul cotelor din regiune este practic, aș spune eu, și cred că nu o să mă greșesc, imposibil să ajungem la 90 de euro în 2025. Ce spuneam de parametri economici ai Moldovei? Atunci când vorbim de cotele la țigări, este o abordare când ne uităm în sume absolute, 36 și 90 de euro, și atunci când aceste sume le transformăm în mărimi relative, comparându-le cu anumiți indicatori micro- sau macroeconomici. Iată, în slide-ul respectiv este reflectată puterea de cumpărare a țigărilor în anul 2020. Acest indicator a fost calculat ca numărul de pachete de țigări care pot fi cumpărate cu un salariu net mediu pe economie și vedem Republica Moldova practic este la mijlocul clasamentului dacă comparăm cu țările Uniunii Europene. Ceea ce înseamnă că în termeni relativi nivelul accizelor în Republica Moldova este unul destul de rațional, corect și adecvat. Rugămintea în următoarele slide-uri. Aici ce spuneam de dispozitivele de încălzire, spuneam că e o măsură îndrăzneață și rapidă. Vedem că Republica Moldova practic este printre primele țări la nivelul mărimii cotii, 700 de lei per 1000 de bucăți. Vedem că multe țări Uniunii Europene aceste cote sunt mai mici. Din acest nivel asigură că impozitarea este una echitabilă întreg spectru de țigări. Aceeași situație este și cu tunul rulat. Următorul slide. Vedem că Republica Moldova de asemenea este la un nivel destul de comparabil cu țările Uniunii Europene, 1200 de lei per kilogram. Acestea sunt două momente în care Republica Moldova a făcut un salt enorm în majorarea cotelor, anume pentru aceste produse care au început să se dezvolte destul de rapid. Ce ține de cotele pe produsele petroliere, de asemenea mergem cu o creștere destul de rapidă. La diesel și benzină creșterea este de 10% în fiecare an, o creștere destul de semnificativă. Dacă să comparăm accizul minim și cel în Uniunea Europeană și cel înregistrat în Republica Moldova, vedem că avem un progres în 5 ani, decalajul acesta se reduce de la 145 euro per litru la 233 euro per litru. Avem o diferență mai mică la motorină, în următorul slide, vă rog. este de la 66 la 108. Aici progresele în majorarea cotelor sunt ceva mai mici pentru că am pornit de la o bază mult mai mică. Plus avem agricultura care consumă multă motorină și nu avem pus la punct un mecanism de subvenționare. Deci suntem restrânși în anumite majorări mai semnificative. Dar în continuare urmează să fie o creștere de 10%. Următoarele slide-uri, ce spuneam eu că trebuie să aducem la parametri economici din Republica Moldova, numărul de litri de benzină pe care putem să procurăm cu un salariu net. Vedem că accesul la aceste produse energetice în Moldova este cel mai mic, dacă comparăm puterea de cumpărare a cetățenilor din Republica Moldova. Aceeași situație este și cu motorina, doar Bulgaria ne întrece la acest capitol, dar practic suntem în fruntea clasamentului. Practic, aici mă limitez la prezentarea care am făcut-o, doar câteva momente ce vreau să precizez. Republica Moldova a început din 2018 să stabilească în codul fiscal cotele accizelor pentru o perioadă de 3 ani. Este un moment salutabil de către mediul de afaceri. Este bine pentru mediul de afaceri să-și facă prognoză pe 3 ani și este bine pentru buget să-și facă prognoză venită pentru buget ca să asigure că pot finanța anumite cheltuieli. Noi am făcut aceasta în 2018 și cotele 2018, 2019 și 2020 practic au rămas neschimbate. Aceeași practică o vom continua pentru 2021, 2022 și 2023. Este pregătit deja proiectul de concept pentru aceste cote. Urmează ca în termen foarte scurt acest concept să fie propus spre consultări. Ca informație, pentru că avem mulți participanți, logica sau raționamentul majorărilor va fi în continuare o creștere de 9-10% pe produse petroliere, o creștere de aproximativ 15% a cotei fixe pentru produsele din tutun și o creștere de 5% pentru produsele alcoolice, pentru că avem deja atins nivelul Uniunii Europene, practic, la toate produsele respective. Eu vă mulțumesc pentru această oportunitate de a participa într-o conferință, după mine, atât ca format, cât și ca participanți unic pentru Republica Moldova. Organizatorii aprecierile mele pentru că au reușit să transforme provocarea COVID într-o oportunitate de a întâlni atât mulți oameni din domeniul fiscalității. Am siguranța că prin această conferință s-a reușit fiscalitatea să o aduceți la un alt nivel, mult mai sus, sub aspect de știință și cunoaștere. Mersi!
Mulțumim mult, domnul Noroc, tuturor speakerilor. A fost o plăcere să trecem prin această, nici nu știu, un almanac de cunoștințe fiscale, toate cumva grupate împreună pe domeniul de TVA și accize. Noi suntem în faza secțiunii în care trebuie să mergem pe întrebări. Și sunt foarte fericită că multe din întrebările care au fost acordate de participanți, de fapt, într-un fel sau altul, deja au fost acoperite de speakerii noștri. Așa s-a întâmplat că majoritatea întrebărilor sunt acordate domnului Noroc. Din aceste întrebări, cred că aș scoate în evidență ceea ce a menționat domnul Noroc la final, că urmează a fi preconizat un calendar, că este destul de provocator, să zic așa, ca acea cotă care a fost agreată în acordul de asociere să fie totuși atinsă către 2025. Aici m-aș opri un pic și l-aș întreba pe domnul Doreu din întrebarea participantului, dezvoltând-o un pic, dar ce facem în acest caz cu acest angajament luat?
Mersi. Este un angajament asumat de către Republica Moldova. Totuși, chiar și în acordul de asociere este scris o prevedere că atunci când în regiuni, și mă refer aici la Ucraina și alte țări din regiunea non-UE, cotele nu ajung la nivelul de 90 de euro, Republica Moldova are posibilitatea să renegocieze acest termen limită. Eu cred că noi suntem înarmați cu argumente suficiente. Noi ne-am fi dorit ca parametrii economice ai Republicii Moldova, nivelul de cumpărare, să ne permită să ajungem la 90 de euro. Din păcate, realitatea este una obiectivă și nu cea pe care poate ne-o dorim. De ce vom fi impuși să discutăm suplimentar cu colegii din Uniunea Europeană.
Foarte interesant. Noi ne bucurăm mult că dumneavoastră aveți așa o abordare deschisă și rațională în ceea ce ține de modul de stabilire a cotelor la accize și de angajare în acest sens. Eu știu, Dan, că mai avem o întrebare care a venit pentru Carl, dacă nu greșesc. Dan?
Da, cred că ar fi o întrebare pentru Karl-Heinz în ceea ce privește procedura de infringement, pentru procedura de infringement în general la nivelul Uniunii Europene, care vizează nearmonizarea unor prevederi din directive. Știu că în România, în momentul în care s-a pus problema primei proceduri de infringement, s-a creat destul de mare panică la nivelul autorităților pentru că era un aspect de noutate. Karl-Heinz, ce ne poți spune legat de această procedură și dacă e într-adevăr o sperietoare atât de mare și cât e de frecventă și care sunt cauzele care în general au condus de-a lungul timpului la astfel de proceduri generate de Comisia Europeană?
Thank you very much for the great question. I'm very happy to briefly answer it. I think infringement procedures, clearly the Commission, the European Commission is the how to say, the guiding institution of the European VAT Directive. So they really have to, will look at whether member states are really conform with the national law, with the EU directive, or actually are breaching it. Now, we have to keep in mind that what is the outcome of an infringement procedure? That it actually goes to the ACJ, where then the ACJ has to decide whether the law is, national law is in line with the directive or not. My experience is that infringement procedures are very, very important, but at the same time, the way until, and they can be how to say, they can be initiated by every taxpayer, every citizen of the EU to actually write to the Commission and complain about it. But I think then when it's at the Commission, I think it's very, very important to actually understand what is the reason. Is it actually, is a law not, is it an administrative practice which is not in line? Is it the law itself? Is a specific article against the EU directive, or is it just the principle like neutrality or proportionality? And there I've seen that depending on what it is, actually, the Commission normally only takes up infringements if it's against a precise article in the directive. If it's an administrative practice, it's neutrality principles, it's very, very difficult for them to do that. Why? Because it's very important to understand there is also a political element involved in all of this infringement. So even if the Commission working level would say, yes, there's possibly an infringement, it goes up to a commissioner level, so higher up in the hierarchy. And before then it goes further in terms of to the ACJ or so on, also politically it has to be decided. So I think it's very, very important to keep in mind that there are various angles to it. It's the working level, it's the technical level, it's the political level, and all of this together then actually decides whether something happens or not. And we have seen it also actually quite often to be positive, because even if it doesn't come to an infringement at the end, it doesn't go to the court, but member states sometimes then change their laws in order not to be infringed by the Commission. So the procedure as such is an important one. It's not always used with the power that the Commission could use it because of political reasons, because you have to keep in mind, the Commission doesn't want to actually upset a member state, because in the Council where you meet again all together, everybody has to say yes to a Commission proposal, so there's unanimity, so you have to keep your friends together, even if you sometimes think you should infringe them. So I think at the end of the day, I don't think the tax administration should fear about it. I think sometimes it makes the law better, or it could also change administrative practices if it is taken up by the Commission. But again, as I mentioned before, we have seen it more and more that this process gets quite political as well. I hope I could answer the question. If not, I'm always happy to follow up.
Thank you very much for your answer. There is, poate, Daniel, dumneavoastră, cu siguranță că ați avea ce să comentați la aceste întrebări care au fost adresate mai devreme, dacă ați vrea să interveniți și dumneavoastră.
Mulțumesc, Veronica, o să fiu foarte scurt, știu că timpul este limitat. Aș vrea să le mulțumesc colegilor din panel pentru intervențiile pe care le-au avut. Să menționez ce am menționat mai devreme, că în zona de simplificare, în sistemul intracomunitar, orice simplificare înseamnă un coșmar, de foarte multe ori în materie de documentație și alte lucruri de genul acesta. Din experiența Republicii Moldova, cred că sunt foarte multe lucruri pe care, evident, colegii din Moldova le pot împrumuta de la colegii din România în materie de cunoștințe și de experiențe pe care le-am trecut. Iar referitor la ce spunea domnul secretar de stat, evident că mediul de afaceri este prins în continuare între cele două lumi și după fiecare criză, tendința guvernelor a fost să repare probleme de colectare a taxelor sau să introducă noi taxe și impozite sau să le majoreze, apropo de discuția de mai devreme privind accizele. Dar în practică s-a demonstrat că astfel de măsuri n-a schimbat, ba chiar dimpotrivă, ponderea taxelor și impozitelor colectate în produsul intern brut în diverse guverne și, evident, nota de plată este întotdeauna decontată de mediul de afaceri. Este bine că și întotdeauna și platforma AmCham este o platformă de discuții extraordinar de bună, în care autoritățile și mediul de afaceri se pot întâlni deseori, tocmai pentru a judeca în ce măsură aceste noi modificări legislative sau de politică fiscală sunt într-adevăr benefice pentru mediul de afaceri. Vă mulțumesc foarte mult și dau legătura celor doi organizatori și moderatori.
Mulțumim mult, Daniel, mulțumim tuturor participanților la panel pentru expunerile făcute. Mulțumim dumneavoastră, celor care ne urmăriți acum în direct pe Zoom sau pe canalul de YouTube al AmCham Moldova. Încheiem acest panel cu rugămintea de a rămâne conectați. Vom avea o scurtă pauză tehnică pentru a permite celorlalți participanți în panelul următor să se alăture conferinței noastre. Vom reîncepe în câteva minute la ora 16 cu o discuție despre ce a adus COVID în realitatea economiei europene, cum ne afectează în prezent și ce așteptăm să se întâmple în perspectivă ca urmare a acestor transformări pe care le-am trăit cu toți în această perioadă. Vom avea alături de noi speakeri interesanți, prin urmare, cu rugămintea de a rămâne alături de noi, vă mulțumesc încă o dată celor participanți în panel și vă rog totodată pe cei care ne urmăriți să rămâneți conectați pentru următoarea sesiune. Vă mulțumesc mult și o zi bună!
Thanks. Salut, vă mulțumesc mult, Veronica. Salut, Dane, succes în continuare.
Mulțumim mult.
Am ocupat, Bye, guys. Thank you. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Karl-Heinz.
Thank you. It was great. All the best.
La revedere. Toate cele bune.
So for the next panel, we have already with us Anthony and Andres. Do you hear us?
Yes, Anders here. I hear you loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. Anthony, do you hear us? Okay, we don't hear us already.
Good morning. Good afternoon, sorry.
Te salut din nou și vă mulțumesc că rămâneți conectați la lucrările conferinței TAXCON'20. Acum este timpul să trecem la cel de-al doilea panel special, care a fost conceput și elaborat grație conlucrării a mai multor AmCham-uri din regiune și ca să-i salut pe colegii noștri din AmCham-urile străine, voi trece la limba engleză. So, hello everybody, hello colleagues. We are delighted to start the second panel of this conference, the special panel, where we are going to exchange different ideas and policies, COVID-related policies that have been applied by tax authorities from different countries in order to help business community to survive in this very difficult period. We had very informative discussions in the previous panel dedicated to harmonization of VAT and excises to EU directive and the effect that it produced to the business community. And now I would like to welcome those 7 AmChams that have been very active in designing this special panel. And here I'm glad to mention AmCham EU, AmCham Romania, AmCham Ukraine, AmCham Bulgaria, AmCham Hungary, AmCham Armenia, AmCham Georgia, and of course AmCham Moldova. And this being said, I would like to again offer the floor to the moderator of the event, Veronica. Here we are.
Thank you very much, Mila. First of all, I would like to say hello to our honorable speakers. It is a pleasure and an honor to have you here. As Mila said, we work together with other AmChams in order to have this panel work exactly in the way in which you will see it today. But we should definitely mention and give credits to those who inspired us in that. I will refer particularly now to one of our board members, Alexandru Guzun, whose energy and enthusiasm provoke us to make this panel work. So basically, together with other colleagues from the AmCham who would join this session till the end of this session, at the moment when the Q&A will be in place, I would like to go through the ideas and the general idea of this panel. But the general idea of this panel was to go a little deeper than just to discuss some technical issues or some let's say very specific policy measures. Basically, we would like to try to understand what's next after the COVID period in the post-COVID era. So, and when we are speaking about what's next, we are definitely referring, first of all, to what about some macroeconomic trends that would affect Central and Eastern Europe in like a year or two. Also, we would like to understand what's next with some specific tax measures that would be implemented here or have been implemented here, and why not what's next with the role of digital in order to make the interaction between our taxpayers and tax administration more efficient to make it more efficient. So saying that, I will jump into the presentation of our speakers. Our first speaker will be Anthony Delanoy. He is Executive Director at the International Monetary Fund. Like by nationality, he is Belgium. He's from Belgium, and he's very proud of that. He used to work for the National Bank of Belgium, and he is very well knowledgeable about the general trends in the region. We have also here William Morris, who is chair of AmCham AmCham EU tax committee, but his main position would be a deputy global tax policy leader at PwC. And also we have here Anders Stitt, who is a strategist from the Swedish tax agency and who will share with us some magic that he usually shares with people with whom he has a chance to speak. Let's go then to our first speaker, Anthony. I give you the floor.
Bună ziua, Veronica. I want to start by thanking you and the American Chamber of Commerce in Moldova for inviting me. It's really a pleasure for me to participate in this panel, and I really look forward to the discussion. I have a short presentation, which I hope you will be able to bring on the screen, in which I want to give you a couple of points on what we have seen from the IMF's perspective globally, but also maybe a bit more focused on Central and Eastern Europe, what we have seen happening during the crisis and what we saw as the challenges before this crisis happened, and then after this crisis is over, hopefully sooner rather than later, what we think will be the challenges going forward globally, but also for the region. And if you go to slide number 3, yeah, this is the one. There's a couple of points I want to make. So first of all, in April this year, in 2020, the IMF presented what we call the initial analysis of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and what we have called the Great Lockdown. In the beginning, much of the discussion we had centered around the so-called V-shaped recovery, consisting of a sharp decrease in economic activity in 2020, followed by a rebound in 2021 and following years, and hopefully without sustaining too much or persistent damage. Now, in the next 2-3 slides, I would like to comment on that based on what we have learned in the past few months. And first of all, it's important to understand that there is extreme uncertainty around the growth forecasts. As the economic fallout of the COVID-19 crisis depends on factors that interact in ways that are really hard to predict for us, and including the pathway of the pandemic, which is very different from one country to another, containment efforts, again, very country specific, supply disruptions, but also behavioral changes and the way people have reacted to the crisis and how they have changed their behavior. Second, the impact varies greatly from one country to another, but even within country groups, it's really interesting to see how even within the group of advanced economies or the group of emerging market economies, you see very big differences in the impact of the crisis. Third, what's important is that developing countries, but also many emerging market countries, are particularly vulnerable during the COVID-19 crisis for a number of reasons. And these reasons, they range from limited healthcare system capacity to access to clean water, but also the ability to enforce physical distancing in very large cities with high population density in developing countries, where many people work in the informal economy and are dependent on being able to work every single day to survive. Many of us in Europe are able to work from home because we have access to reliable and high-speed internet, but such connectivity is limited in many developing countries and even in some emerging market economies. And these countries are also highly dependent on demand in advanced economies for the export of their goods and services. Other reasons are the lack of fiscal space, especially for countries with very high public debt levels, and the dwindling access to reserve currency, either because sources of reserve currency drying up, for example, from tourism, or because it's becoming increasingly expensive to go to the capital markets. So in the baseline scenario that we presented during the 2020 spring meetings in April, we assumed that the pandemic would fade in the second half of 2020, and so that what we call the Great Lockdown could progressively be unwound. Now, however, it is becoming increasingly clear that other less benign scenarios are materializing, as the outbreak is lasting much longer than we initially anticipated, and it's forcing many countries to either extend lockdowns or even to reinstate lockdowns as infection rates are surging again. If you go to the next slide, I gave a couple of examples of emerging market economies in Central and Eastern Europe and in the Caucasus. And if you look at those numbers, the numbers seem to confirm the idea of a V-shaped recovery. So all countries are experiencing a sharp decrease in economic activity in 2020, and it's followed by a rebound in next year in 2021. But if you look carefully at the graph, there is an important caveat. And the rebound does not fully make up for lost activity. And by our estimates, it will take several years before economic growth will pick up with the pre-crisis trend. And this is what you see in the red circle on the graph. So even by 2023, we do not expect economic activity to have picked up with the trend. In some cases, we don't expect this to happen before 2025, for example, which means that the impact of this crisis is going to be very long lasting. And a lot, of course, depends on countries' responses to the crisis. We have, at the IMF, we developed a policy tracker on our website, which tracks the economic responses to the crisis country by country, including countries in Central and Eastern Europe. So if you're interested, you can go to our website and choose a specific country and see what actions they have undertaken to deal with this crisis. I would like to mention, though, you have to be careful when you compare countries with one another. And the reason is the automatic stabilizers. Previously existing automatic stabilizers are not registered as new measures. So to give one example, many of the measures taken in the United States as a response to the COVID-19 crisis, like paid sick leave, certain unemployment benefits, and so on, they already existed in many European countries. So if you go on our website, you will see that the US has taken a lot of new measures, while those measures haven't been taken in Europe because they already existed. And so what is considered a new measure to address the COVID-19 crisis in the US is not considered part of the COVID-19 response in many European countries, as these automatic stabilizers, of course, already existed as part of the social security system before the crisis. The IMF, of course, has responded quickly to the COVID-19 crisis, mainly through mobilizing emergency financing. All in all, we have approved emergency financing or new programs for over 87 billion US dollars in 86 countries since March to address the COVID-19 crisis. And some examples in Central and Eastern Europe are, for example, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine. This emergency financing will help countries to deal with, I would call, phase one of the crisis, which is the phase we are still in. This is to address the immediate fallout. The big question, of course, is whether this financing will be sufficient to deal with the longer term consequences, and whether many of these countries that have received emergency financing will have to come back to the IMF or other multilateral or institutions for follow-up programs to deal with the longer term implications. If you can go to the next slide, I would like to say something about the challenges beyond the crisis. What you see on this slide is what were considered by participants in the World Economic Forum some of the main challenges before the COVID-19 outbreak. And I can summarize them as four broad risks. The first being climate change, the second being economic confrontations like trade wars, for example, between the US and China or the US and the European Union. The third one is populism and increasing political polarization. It's an important one because it makes it much harder to pursue reforms. And last but not least, cybersecurity. Those were the four main risks that people saw as the biggest challenges in the months ahead before the crisis happened. So the question now is how much of that has changed since the COVID-19 outbreak. So if you go to the last slide. First of all, very important is, I already showed it on the graph before in the red circle, there will be a permanent output loss as some activity will not return or may take years to return to pre-crisis level. Think, for example, about the travel and tourism sector, which account for about 10% of global GDP, but also the hospitality sector like restaurants and bars. This loss of permanent output will have a disproportionate impact, of course, on smaller states whose economies are often highly exposed to one or two sectors, or countries heavily dependent on tourism. The second challenge is that the new normal will look very differently due to physical distancing and increased digitization, which will impact the way we work with increased and more generalized telework in countries where that is possible. The way we shop, which will have, of course, an impact on brick and mortar stores in our cities, and the way we travel. And one should not underestimate the impact of increasing digitization. The more we work digitally, the more important cybersecurity becomes. It's no coincidence that since the start of the COVID-19 crisis, cyber incidents have increased exponentially. But digitization also has an impact on data and privacy legislation, and equally important on tax legislation. For example, how to define physical presence, source, and destination when people work more online and technically could work from anywhere around the world. Another question that we have been looking at the IMF is, should automation and digitization be taxed versus labor taxation, for example, as is mostly the case today? This will have a huge impact on tax income for countries, but also for individuals and the way we think about international taxation cooperation. Third, the public debt levels are projected to increase substantially as a result of the impact of the COVID-19 crisis. Public debt levels worldwide were already very high by historical standards as a result of the global financial crisis that started in 2008. And they have now reached levels comparable with those after World War II. And this raises questions about longer-term sustainability, but it also has an impact on monetary policy, for example. Even before the COVID-19 crisis, interest rates were expected to remain what we at the fund called low for longer, with inflation remaining below targets and many countries being dependent on very low interest rates to be able to refinance their very high public debt levels. Fourth, we probably need to rethink which sectors were deemed strategic or systemic. We have become highly dependent on global supply chains, which, as it now turns out, cannot always be guaranteed to be there. So it raises the question whether it would not be better to shorten certain supply chains, especially for critical goods like food and medical equipment. Also, during the global financial crisis that started in 2008, governments bailed out banks because they were considered systemically important. So to avoid the banks privatizing profits in good times and socializing losses in times of crisis, we imposed higher capital requirements and buffers on the banks. The question now is whether certain private companies, like, for example, airlines, are a systemic business. And judging from the billions in government support they are requesting, they seem to believe they are. But just like for the banks, being systemic also implies certain responsibilities, because many private companies requesting government support have for years optimized or evaded taxes, or they have spent billions paying out dividends or buying own shares. So if these companies are systemic and should receive government bailouts, then a discussion is needed on fairer taxation, higher capital requirements, and buffers to deal with shocks. And last but not least, the original crisis, the big crisis that we were facing before the crisis didn't disappear. Before the COVID-19 outbreak, we were already facing one of the most important challenges facing our way of life, climate change. So in dealing with the COVID-19 crisis, we will have to ensure that once we go to the recovery phase, that recovery helps, or at a minimum does not impede the necessary transition to a greener economy. So if I were to conclude, I think the biggest challenge we are now facing is to make sure that all of these challenges that I've mentioned, that they add up. The ones we faced before the crisis, the new challenges we are facing because of the crisis. So how do we finance a more sustainable, greener economic recovery and transition, while at the same time ensuring that sustainability? So let me stop here. This is a very broad overview of how we see the challenges. I'm of course happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Anthony. It is a very interesting and comprehensive analysis of what is going on in the region. We will take the questions in the end of the session. And now maybe we would better continue with our speakers. And in the end, we will take all the questions, if it's work for you. Yep. Okay, perfect. Then we will continue with our second speaker. We will continue with William Morris. By the way, before going to William Morris, I would like to say hello to my colleagues from AmCham EU, Stefano, hello, and my colleague from AmCham Bulgaria, Daniel, hello. And William Morris, now you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Veronica, and thank you very much, all of you, for inviting me and for attending this this great conference. I hope that one conference doesn't make a tradition, but I hope you'll invite me back next year, by which time it'll be a firm tradition. So congratulations for setting this up. One of my first visits to Central and Eastern Europe was back in the very early 2000s, when I just moved back from the US, and I visited the AmCham Romania and had a very nice meeting. It struck me that at that point, the only foreign tax advisor or foreign tax representative of any company in Romania was from Philip Morris, but the economy has expanded since then. So it's great to be back and to be involved. So look, Anthony gave a great introduction to this, and I'm not an economist. That doesn't stop me sometimes from trying, but I just want to touch on one or two of the points because they're a very important background, in particular to the way that the EU thinks about this, and that is an important context. I'll talk about digital, which Anthony touched on as well. But I know that you have a panel on that as well, so I'm not going to talk too much about it. But I do just want to talk about some of the background, which is important because Anthony has talked about some of the macro stuff. But I want to talk about how tax policy has developed over the past 10 or 15 years, and importantly, how tax policy has become a topic of public interest in a way that I don't really think it ever was before. And that has meant that the political pressures in tax policy making have increased dramatically. To be sure, tax policy in the end has always been about money. It's been about raising money for governments to spend, and that has meant that tax policy is never a dry academic subject which can be practiced from the top of an ivory tower. There's always been an element of politics in it, but that has really increased dramatically since the financial crisis, since the Great Recession, and that has increased the importance of multinational taxes. You can take this back probably to the late 80s, to the late 70s, the beginning of the 80s, and what we now view as the start of globalization, in particular, the removal of capital controls and the ability of capital to flow freely across borders. That enabled investment to flow much more freely. It enabled corporations to globalize. At the same time, taken with trends such as digitalization, which means that in 30 or 40 years, these are very, very rough numbers. The average balance sheet of a corporation has moved from being 80 or 90% tangible assets and 10 to 20% intangible property, intellectual property, to being to being the inverse in many cases. And obviously, the portability, the mobility of IP, and also the ability to do business remotely have presented challenges to tax rules, and have also presented opportunities for businesses to engage in tax planning. One of the things which changed, and I mentioned it already, and Anthony referred to it as well, is the global financial crisis, and what that did in terms of the impact on government revenues, but also what it did in terms of the impact of the views of populations about globalization, about large corporations, about governments for that matter, and this increased interest in tax. And the emphasis, a growing emphasis on fair taxation, also linked again to the other issues that Anthony mentioned, concern about climate, which has led to increased interest in green taxes. One thing that I would say about what we need to be thinking about in terms of the next couple of years is that in many ways we are still in the acute phase of this crisis, of the COVID-19 crisis. We're still at the point where governments are trying to keep the virus under control, obviously to work towards vaccines, to keep companies, businesses propped up, in that expectation, as Anthony said, that there will be some type of a bounce back at some point. But equally, we're beginning to see the end of government's abilities, or maybe their patience, I don't know, a mix of the two, to finance all of these measures. And the withdrawal of that is going to, particularly hopefully as we move towards a vaccine, is going to move us out of the acute phase, but into the chronic phase. And in addition to all of the other points, that the macro points that Anthony mentioned, a couple of slightly more micro ones are firstly that people have been talking about a K-shaped recovery. And Anthony said that, in Europe and in the US for that matter, where I am, there are many people who have the ability to work from home. That's true. But even in Europe, there are plenty of people who do not have the ability to work from home. Those are in the service industries. And clearly, as you go towards developing countries, that becomes more and more true. So the questions which have swirled around for the past 10 years about inequality are not going to go away. In fact, they're going to get more pronounced. And that is going to have an impact on tax policy, on all sorts of policy, but on tax policy. The other is that even though a lot of companies so far have been kept going with government support, there appears to be quite a lot of evidence that in terms of cash flow and in terms of the strength of their balance sheets, these companies are greatly diminished. Their ability to plan out into the future, to grow employment, are all going to be hampered by the fact that they simply don't have the assets that they had before. And that is going to make the economy much slower. At the same time, again, while, as Anthony said, because of the automatic stabilizers, this doesn't show up in countries' accounts in quite the same way. A staggering amount of money has still been spent by governments over the past 6 months and will need to be spent by governments. And while interest rates are historically low, so this can be piled onto debt, there is going to be pressure, and we see this at the EU level. Eventually, I'll get around to talking to my slides, I promise you, Veronica. But we see this also at the EU level, but some of that is going to have to be recouped through the tax system. So there is that pressure is going to emerge. The other thing is we cannot tell at the moment exactly how this is going to play out. But again, if the financial crisis is any indication of this, it wasn't in the acute phase of the crisis that public anger really began to drive policy. At that point, people were pulling together. It was in the chronic phase as budget cuts arose, as it appeared that to use sort of the well-worn phrases of the time, not a single banker had spent a single night in prison, all of that type of stuff, that the anger really began to influence policy. And I was just looking it up to check my dates. But the movement, the Occupy Wall Street movement, which obviously spread to Occupy London and all sorts of other places, that expression of public anger took place almost to the day, or started almost to the day, 2 years after Lehman Brothers collapsed. It took 2 years for the anger to build to a level where people went out on the streets. I actually think we're likely to see that a little sooner this time, in part because it's so close to the last crisis. But again, that is going to dramatically influence public policy, and all of the statements that businesses make, and indeed that economists make, about the need for investment, about the need for stable tax policy, are going to come up against this public anger. Okay, so that's the background, probably taking up all the time that I was meant to have. That's the background on the slides that I'm now going to go through very, very quickly, I promise. So if you could put those back up. Thanks. So if we go on to the first slide, I'm going to talk a little about what the EU has done, and the first is actually a non-tax measure, which is about the waiver of state aid rules. And obviously, as we're talking about immediate responses to the crisis, and as I say, I think we're still in the chronic phase of this. in the acute phase of this. Waiving some of the state aid rules was obviously an important thing to do. This is not a tax issue as such, but it is intimately related to tax issues because of the way that public support can be delivered. So if we go on to the next slide, talking a little about the recovery plan. No, go back a slide, please. There we go. So the recovery plan, the Next Generation EU, has this 750 billion euro fund, 390 of that in grants, 360 of it in loans. Again, there's a sort of tax funding issue lurking in the background of this. But again, you know, this is some idea of the quantums that are going to need to be spent. Now, you know, a lot of this is going to be sensible investment. A lot of this will go into green investment in particular. And, you know, over time, that will produce results. It won't produce immediate results. And, you know, there are in place measures in the EU not to have to collect on this money until late into the 2020s. So there isn't, again, an immediate tax need here. But this will, if nothing else, increase the perception that the taxes need to be raised, particularly on those who can afford to pay it. And obviously that, in a sense, is a subjective measure. But at the same time, we heard this last week, late last week, coming out of the informal ECOFIN in Germany. We heard it again in the Parliament yesterday. We've heard it in various speeches by commissioners, including Commissioner Breton. We've heard it from the French finance minister, that this particularly means digital companies, companies which are perceived, in quotation marks, to have done well out of the crisis. And that is going to be a pressure point. So we need to bear that in mind. In terms of own resources, which is going to be the method to pay back these funds, there are essentially four things that they've talked about. There's a non-recycled plastic waste. That's a relatively minor thing. Obviously, it fits in with the green agenda, with the Green New Deal. A carbon-based adjustment and digital levies. Again, these are slated for the beginning of 2023, and we don't fully have the details, certainly on the digital levy. And I have a couple of slides which go into this a little more. Sort of rebooting of the emissions trading scheme, which again is somewhere between a tax and not a tax. And then various other things, a corporate levy, the shape of which is unclear, but certainly as it's been talked about, is not a net income tax, not a tax on profits as such, but could actually be a tax on gross revenue. And there are all sorts of economic problems with taxes on gross revenue, but nevertheless, that also reflects the direction taken in the digital services tax. So with the carbon border adjustment measure, again, I'm not going to go into this in any detail. Certainly, you know, the old energy tax directive really is now quite old and doesn't cover all of the things that policymakers would now like it to cover. At the same time, it is contentious inside the EU, in particular because of, for example, the interest that Poland has in coal. We don't expect anything until later this year, earlier next year, and indeed, perhaps the change in commissioners may have some impact on this, although I doubt it. And you know, it does have to apply in a non-discriminatory manner. We go on to the next slide, please. As I say, the Energy Tax Directive review, the Energy Tax Directive is quite old. This would look at how it could be updated, how it could now apply to climate change. You may have seen an announcement out of Brussels, I think by the Commission President, Mrs. von der Leyen, about the Commission increasing its goal on emissions from a 40% reduction to a 55% reduction. I think by 2030, which is, you know, quite a significant increase. Again, these rules will have to pay some attention to this. There is also, and this is you know, again, more of a, not quite a philosophical question, maybe a macro question. You know, there are concerns that some of the taxes which are around have already topped out and therefore there is a very strong incentive to use new taxes, particularly these green taxes, to raise additional revenue rather than trying to get a few more points out of the corporate income tax, or indeed to continue to raise VATs. I think there are some countries which feel that the 20 to 25% range is about as high as they can go. So there will be a lot of pressure to raise energy taxes, and there are some interesting indications that business is beginning to get behind this as well. Again, from the US, there's a very influential business group called the Business Roundtable, and yesterday they came out in favor of some type of carbon pricing, whether it turns out to be a carbon tax as such, or some type of ETS, or indeed some other mechanism. They weren't completely clear, but the fact that an organization like BRT can swing behind that does mean that that I think we may see something here. Okay, if we could move on to the next slide, please. I want to talk just a little about the OECD because I'm also involved with the OECD. And the OECD, while not a legislative body like the European Commission, does have the ability to put out recommendations. It is a sort of key standard setter. And they have put out a number of important recommendations, which many countries have followed, on how to respond to the immediate COVID-19 crisis, and indeed how to go beyond that. So in addition to the work that Anthony was talking about, that the fund have done, also, they have been tracking this. They've been doing analyses. They've worked with tax administrators, which has been very important to give practical, and Anders will know about this, to give practical advice to tax authorities on, suspending certain types of activities, extending deadlines, working on business continuity. There has also been work on transfer pricing, for example. What do you do with transfer pricing during the crisis when the comparables, for example, on amounts paid to distributors, should there be loss sharing, for example? Can the comparables reduce the cost plus return under certain circumstances down to zero, even below zero? So again, work at the OECD there to help businesses, with their taxes in this crisis year. And also an important recommendation not to raise taxes too early, sorry, typo there, 200 early, which could stall recovery, but certainly in the medium to long term, the OECD has said that those will need to be part of the fiscal mix. Again, if we go on to the next slide, these are some of the short-term measures that I was talking about, obvious ones that many governments have done. Filing extensions, payment deferrals, just basically not adding further pressure to businesses when they're already trying to deal with so many other crises. With business liquidity, loan guarantees, expanded loss carrybacks, all of those types of things. And again, query whether these are covered by, at least in the case of smaller companies, by that state aid exception as well that I mentioned right at the beginning. And then households, direct income support, again, as Anthony was saying, some of these, whether it's certainly in terms of unemployment benefits, obviously exist as automatic stabilizers in many countries, but not in others. Lowered in VAT and import duties. So, again, a lot of things done to prevent the crisis from, at least the tax, the general tax regulations, the administration of tax from applying too broadly. Then if we go on to the next page, there are just a couple of examples from countries. So I picked 3 EU countries. So corporate income tax, expanded loss carrybacks, so enabling people to take advantage of their losses to carry them back against future years, which effectively means getting refunds. Not just not having to pay taxes, but also in many cases getting refunds. VAT, deferral of payments to the end of the year in certain cases, and with social security taxes, social security contributions, reimbursements in the case of workers on reduced hours. And these obviously complement furlough payments to enable businesses to keep people on their books, even if they haven't been working. Go on to the next one. which is France. Again, not dissimilar, but slightly different in some respects. VAT reduction on rates on certain types of products, in this case, personal protection equipment and those types, that type of stuff. Again, with social security taxes aimed at the SME side of the ledger. But again, a number of options here to, and particularly in France, this is important because the so-called tax wedge is so large. And then other types of benefits, creation of a solidarity fund for smaller companies to enable those to stay alive. And then one final set of examples from Poland, I think, slightly closer to home. Thanks. So again, on VAT, a postponement of new rates in this case by 3 months. CIT, again, essentially allowing a carryback into 2019. Some provisions for municipalities on property taxes, and administrative ones again on extending the timelines. So you begin to see in all of this, a pattern that emerges. So I've talked, although in a sense in a reverse order, about what responses to the crisis might be. In the short term, it's about taking the pressure off businesses. It's about doing whatever you can to remove some of that burden in order to allow businesses to freely deal with the very real burden, which is, reduced sales, the reduced ability to sell into any markets, how to, keep employees on the roll and employed. And then in the medium to long term, how is it that you think about financing the crisis? But also, are there other things to do to meet other factors which are out there? The climate change that Anthony talked about at the beginning, and some of the things we've talked about here in relation to carbon pricing, to the energy tax directive, to the emissions trading scheme. But also digital, which I haven't really talked about, and which I'm now not going to talk about because I really have talked for too long. But again, increasing digitalization, more and more emphasis on intellectual property, the ability to do business remotely, means that taxation on digital, and in particular taxation on companies which are perceived to have done very well out of the crisis, is going to become one of the dominant themes of the next few years. So there we are, having run way over. Let me put myself on mute. But thank you all very much.
William, it is always a pleasure to hear your thoughts on one particular thing or another. So don't worry that it was a little maybe longer than we were expected. I think the ideas that you shared with us are like priceless. Thank you very much.
That's very kind.
And let's move to our third speaker. I have introduced him a little bit in the beginning, like a magician. Let's see what will be the magic what Anders will bring us today here.
Okay. Well, thank you. What can I say with such an introduction? First of all, I'm so honored to get the opportunity to participate in this conference. So thank you so much, colleagues from all the different countries. And the topic for this session is COVID-19 pandemics, a booster of the tax administration's digitalization in Central and Eastern Europe. And first of all, I think the pandemic is, of course, horrible in many ways, not only from the health perspective, but also when it comes to people and businesses' everyday lives. Fear, uncertainties, feelings of vulnerability, loss of control. It has created, of course, a stressful environment for many taxpayers. And we lived in a rapidly changing world before the pandemic. But taxpayers' environment changed even faster after the outbreak, as you all know. And digitalization, it's not a goal in itself. It's a means, and it's important to see it that way, I think. It gives us possibilities to increase compliance and make it easier for taxpayers to fulfill their obligation and to utilize their rights. So in this regard, I think that it has many advantages in this current pandemic situation. You can, through digitalization, achieve all of this perfectly safe from COVID-19. You don't have to visit offices, and you can get information and fulfill your obligations with your mobile, and you can participate in conventions like this one from a COVID-safe environment if you have access to the internet. But that one challenge when it comes to digitalization is that we tend to use it as a layer on our mental models, which are heavily influenced by linear process thinking and a case-by-case mentality, at least within the tax administrations. We think a tax return, an e-service to file the tax return is more or less the same, but you do it electronically. It has improved taxpayer service, yes, but does it use the full potential of digitalization? I would say no. So I think it's important that we don't use digitalization to make the past solutions more efficient, because it gives the possibility to achieve what we want to achieve in completely different ways. I think it's more efficient for everyone if we as tax administrations understand and see taxpayers' situation and environment as a system, and that we try our best to make the system work as smooth, easy, and fair as possible, taking in consideration, of course, the taxpaying challenges and situations. So instead of building an e-service where you can file your return, we may cooperate with software developers, resulting in solutions perhaps accessible in the software the taxpayers use, like bookkeeping systems, you have salary systems, banking systems, integrated solutions. It may be much easier for taxpayers instead of like 50 different e-services to different agencies. And we have a strong tradition of collecting information, and usually through different kind of forms, you know, from taxpayers, and then as tax administration we compare it with the rules. But digitalization gives us the possibility to break this kind of thinking and working, and let me give you an example. In Sweden, if you have a company car that you use in your business activity and privately, you should have a logbook with information about date, time, distance, the purpose of the trip, etc. And there are, of course, some tax issues related to this information. I mean, as a taxpayer, you can read about these tax issues and the logbook on our website. And we could have built an e-service for taxpayers where you can fill in this information, but it's also possible to just have a button in the car. A button, and you push the button if you do a business trip. The difference is that taxpayers, they don't have to go to our website and read about the legislation in order to do it right. You don't have to use an e-service either. But we as tax administrations, we have to give like clear and up-to-date information as algorithms, as input to those who develop these systems in the cars. The logbook, it's generated automatically with a minimum of administrative burden. And the taxpayers, they fulfill their obligation in their environment. So what we do is to bring the rules to taxpayers' information to get it right from the start. Not to collect the taxpayers' information and compare it with the rules after the transactions have occurred, which we have done historically many times. And tax compliance by design, which use blockchain technology and application programming interfaces, we think that is the way forward as we see it. And we also, as Anthony stressed out, we want to really make sure that the solutions are safe and secure. It's also essential to protect integrity and to safeguard that other sensitive information does not come in the wrong hands. And this is about trust, of course, which is very, very important. So I think that digitalization done right, it has a strong potential to minimize administrative burdens. we can increase predictability and get it more right from the start. But digitalization done without understanding and considering taxpayers' perspective, it may backfire. And let me give you an example. The thing is that many taxpayers, they still call or visit us, even if we have digital services. And some people, they have read the information on our website and still call or visit us with the exact same issue they have read on the web. And sometimes we tend to think that this is strange. We ask them, have you read the information on our web? And they say, yeah. But this example, which I think you all can relate to, says more about our sometimes introvert perspective. Because when listening to taxpayers, it's clear that it's not easy or obvious for them that this information is the only relevant information that they have to read or consider. I mean, we, in this conference, perhaps, we know about taxes and we can automatically put this in a context and we do it without thinking about it. But for those who does not know the context, which I think is the majority of taxpayers, it can be very hard to understand what to do in order to do it right. And here I think digitalization done right could strengthen taxpayers' awareness. It can strengthen sense of control and understanding and minimizing uncertainty and increasing predictability, which I think, because what Anthony said, the pandemic, it will go on for some time, is very, very important right now. And we as tax administration, we can achieve this. The taxpayers, they will not feel the need to call or visit us because of uncertainty from their perspective. And therefore, I think digitalization is about functionality, but also about emotions and context. And the topic for this session was if the pandemic situation can be a booster for tax administration's digitalization. And I think the answer to that question is yes. But it's not the same as if it benefits taxpayers and tax administrations. Because in order to do so, it's more about how we use digitalization. It's not a good idea to start from our own internal processes, which we sometimes do. Instead, I think in order to success, we need to start from taxpayer situation and taxpayers' perspective and ask ourselves, how can we contribute and improve this situation? We should strive for understanding emotions like sense of control, fairness, and predictability, and use this knowledge when we build and improve IT solutions. We should see digitalization as part of a system, an environment with perception of fairness and unfair competition. And also one thing that is very important, which we realized at the Swedish tax administration, is that when the pandemic broke out, our system, they were not so flexible. So the legislation was fast, but it was hard for us to adopt this legislation into our IT system. So I think a good idea for the future, it is also to build a system ready for fast changes, because new things can happen. And cooperation and voluntary approach is essential, as I see it. If we make solutions so good that taxpayers prefer them, it's better than forcing taxpayers to use them. So digitalization, considering these perspectives, have, in my opinion, strong potential to create value and an easier everyday life for both taxpayers and tax administration, as well as contributing to a good development in society, especially when it comes to Central and Eastern European countries. Thank you.
Anders, thank you.
Yes.
It was inspiring about the tax administration. I really hope. I know that in the registration there were a lot of colleagues, my further colleagues from the tax administration who were registered, and I really hope the things that you just mentioned will be an interesting input for them. But it is also an interesting input for us, because now we know how to ask our tax administration to deal with our problems, you know, in this particular situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we are now moving smoothly to our Q&A session. Basically, we have received 2 questions, one by YouTube and one by Zoom. But before that, I would like to ask our colleagues, our co-moderators, Daniel or Stefano, maybe you would like to add something to comment on what you just have heard. Stefano, Daniel. Daniel? We cannot hear you, sorry. No. maybe you would reconnect or yeah, okay. Then we will move to Stefano.
Thank you so much, Veronica, and thank you so much from all the panelists. I'm Stefano Marmor from AmCham EU, and having obviously Will Morris here, the chair of the tax committee, is really great. No questions from my side. Just wanted to say that it was really comprehensive, and really just wanted to thank you for the organization and all the panelists. Look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you. It was short. Okay. I don't know if Daniel have reconnected, but before that, maybe we can go, Dan, maybe we can go with the questions.
Yes, sure. I think I would first want to thank you, Andres, for the good perspective that he gave us in terms of how to use technology, because it's indeed a new approach in trying not to adapt what we currently have in terms of tax procedures to the technologies, but to use technologies just to entirely reshape the way we interact with the taxpayers. So I think this is indeed a revolutionary approach that everybody in the tax administration should have in mind, instead of trying to use the old way to improve the processes by using a computer, but just to entirely rethink the tax systems and to create tools that are built into the accounting software of the companies or into their ERP systems that will automatically maybe provide information to the tax authorities or help this interaction between the taxpayer and the tax authorities. Thank you indeed for your insight in this, and the Swedish tax system, it's indeed an inspiration for all of us. Now going to the questions, I think you can also see directly in the Q&A section, we have a question for Anthony. Anthony, I read the question for everybody to hear it, because we have a lot of participants into the YouTube channel, so I don't think they are able to see it. So the question for Anthony is, what would you recommend to the CE region countries in order to prepare for the perspective you've outlined in your presentation? There are a lot of intentions currently from international stakeholders to provide the region with various emergency financial support instruments. Supposing we would be talking about a comprehensive emergency financial toolkit, what should this toolkit contain, in your opinion, to cope with these challenges that you presented?
Thank you, Dan. I'm very happy to answer, but let me start by thanking William and Anders also for their presentations. I thought it was very interesting, and I think we were all very complimentary, which we didn't plan to be, but you know, it turned out that way, so that's really great. I would also like to start with William said something about intangible assets becoming a very large part of the balance sheet. I started my career as a financial analyst in a bank, and one day I had to analyze a Chinese bank's balance sheet, and they had translated in the annual report intangible assets as invisible assets, which I thought was quite interesting. I could see myself standing there on a green field in China, and somebody standing next to me saying, "Look, this is our bank, but you know, it's invisible." But anyway. So on the question, I think it's a really good question. What I would say is that there are basically three phases in this crisis, right? And what you are doing as a country is really depending on which phase you're in. I think the first phase is the one we are facing at the moment, the emergency phase, where you take a lot of blanket measures because you just want to prop up the economy as much as you can and avoid long-lasting damage. And this is where emergency financing from the IMF and other financial institutions comes in very handy. It gets a little bit more tricky once you move to the second phase, which hopefully is going to start soon. And some of us are already starting to think about it because this blanket measures we've been taking are extremely expensive. And there is, of course, a limit to how much money governments can spend and borrow from markets or from financial institutions. The second phase is really a transition where you start moving away from blanket measures to more focused measures. For example, to allow a reallocation of labor. Because what we have done in what we see in many countries is that they have these temporary unemployment schemes, which is great because it keeps people in the company. They are still employed, but they are getting unemployment benefits for a certain amount of time. The question, of course, is if you're working for an airline company and airline travel is not going to come back anytime soon, this is not something that's sustainable. And then we have to start thinking about maybe 20% of workers in the airline industry is going to have to move to different sectors. And that is not going to happen as long as you keep on giving them temporary unemployment benefits. So this whole transition, you have to start thinking about, okay, how do we move people from business or from activity that is never going to come back or not coming back in the foreseeable future? And that's very tricky to do. And I think the third phase is where you really think about long-term structural measures. Those people that lose their jobs, how can you retrain them, re-educate them so that they can fit in whatever comes next? And whatever comes next is something you have to really think about because I mentioned, a greener, more sustainable economy. And so these are sectors where obviously there is more, where there's a future. Same with the digitization that was mentioned. More digital activity is going to require different skills and so on. So as a country, I think you have to deal with those three phases. In terms of the financing, unfortunately, I don't think there is something as a comprehensive emergency financial toolkit. The IMF does its part. We can give what we call balance of payment support. The World Bank is doing. The European Union has several support measures. And I think it's up to the countries, up to a point, to kind of have a comprehensive strategy within those three phases to move things forward. But again, it really depends on how you see your own economy evolving and what parts of the economy have a future and which unfortunately don't because of changed circumstances.
Yeah, it's absolutely right what you have just mentioned. It's quite a multi-dimension, aspects of how it could be treated.
And Veronica, if I may, William mentioned...
You make me think a little bit more than I have to about that. So I will let you continue and I will continue thinking, sorry.
If I may, I think William made a very good point when he mentioned the popular anger when that comes in the chronic phase, right? I mean, when you look at the challenges we were seeing before the COVID-19 crisis, I mentioned increasing populism that was making it very hard to do certain reforms. Even before the crisis, we were already still facing the anger as a result of the global financial crisis, right? People were still upset about that. And at the moment, people are focused on survival, right? Because this virus is here. We're about to lose our jobs. People are getting sick. So we're really focused on that. But I think he's absolutely right that anger is going to come back as soon as we go to the chronic phase and maybe even more than before. And so that's going to be an additional challenge because when you do that transition phase, you're going to have to tell people you've been working in an airline industry for, let's say, 10 years, but your job doesn't exist anymore. And you're going to have to do something completely different with your life, which is hard for people, right? Because they've been trained in a certain way. And all of a sudden, all that falls away. And then they see at the same time these digital companies making billions of dollars, and so that anger that he mentioned is going to be an extra dimension they're going to have to face.
Agree, definitely agree with you on that. Oh, Anthony, thank you very much for your answer for that question. I think Daniel is back, and basically he tried to put a question in a chat. Daniel, is it better now? No, we cannot hear you. Sorry. I will address your question.
Sure.
Oh, now
Yeah.
I can hear you.
Yeah.
No, but please continue.
It is a real pleasure for a novice like me to hear and listen quite distinguished experts and professionals speaking about not only taxation, but how we can survive as communities, as nations, as partners and businesses, not only through COVID-19 situation and crisis, but prior to that period and anger that Anthony mentioned several times. And I started worrying not only about my income declaration that I have to fill till the end of the year, but how we can be much more productive and flexible in order to deliver what we can do and to deliver to our members and to the businesses that we are running. My question is taking no ground of the environment that I'm working and living right now, Bulgaria, but it's a little bit more generic one. We've witnessed a wave of protectionism all over the past months. And at least in Bulgaria, in Romania, as far as I know, there are examples of and attempts by the governments to withdraw or take away income from the businesses in order to continue development their government programs. But they're not doing it in a way that the businesses is willing to support such measures, but by ad hoc legislative changes. And that worries me. My question is how an AmCham or how a business community can fight back, can sustain or can oppose such initiatives implemented and introduced by a so-called democratic government, EU member state, or other kind of authority that we have to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you address this question to any of our panelists or to somebody in particular?
Yeah, particularly I address it to Mr. Morris and to Mr. Street because it's very important for me to have the transatlantic perspective and the Nordic perspective. But if Mr. Delanoy wants to address it, or other panelists, or taking your answer from Moldova, it would be excellent.
Thank you, Daniel. I would ask maybe William, would you like to jump in and to try to give your perspective on that?
Sure. And I also want to let Anders off the hook because I think this is probably a more difficult question for him to answer than it is for me. You know, at one level, obviously, you know, you put your finger on the problem, which is that a legitimately elected government, which controls a parliament, has, at least in tax matters, even inside the EU, very wide discretion. I mean, you know, absent bumping up against the European freedoms or directives already in place, to put in place tax measures that it wants to. And the only true accountability for that is at the next election. And, you know, in that sense, you know, there's not a great deal you can do about it. I mean, there are occasions when there are provisions in constitutions which, you know, prevent some types of taxes from being levied. And obviously, those are worth looking at. There are also other occasions where if the taxes are particularly discriminatory, then, you know, some people have fallen back on the human rights arguments, which occasionally are successful. And, you know, equally, if the imposition is arbitrary, so it's not directly a piece of legislation, but it's the use of tax tools already in place, but only aimed at certain businesses, then again, there should be remedies in the courts against that type of arbitrary imposition. So it depends it depends somewhat, at least, on the facts of what you're talking about. I mean, you know, there are clearly cases you know, I'm going to say outside the EU, where tax inspectors impose very arbitrary assessments in the hope, essentially, of shaking down taxpayers. You know, that's undesirable. In certain cases, there are incentives built into pay scales which encourage people to raise large assessments. All of these things are just a bad tax practice and do need dealing with. But if these are substantive measures, albeit ones affecting certain sectors, and you know they are passed through the Parliament, then in one sense it's hard to do anything about that. Now, in terms of what AmChams can do, you know, my experience is that they can shed a little light on this, and they can do that in a couple of ways. They can do that by talking about the impact on the businesses involved. They can do that by talking about the impact on jobs. They can do it by talking about the impact on consumers. And you know, one very important thing, particularly in you know, in CEE, is the effect that this has on investments from other parts of the EU and from outside of the EU. And if there are two elements to that in turn. The first is, does this make it a less attractive environment in which to invest because the rates are too high or whatever? But the other, which is equally important, which is a little less tangible, but as I say, is just as important, is if a perception grows that the rule of law is not being observed, that the tax authority doesn't interpret the tax laws equally to all taxpayers, then that affects the investment environment very meaningfully as well. So it's making those arguments. And then, you know, the last is a general educative one, which is that there is always in every country a tension between those parts of the government, particularly the tax authorities, obviously, which want to raise money in order to be able to spend it, and those parts of the government which are more focused on jobs, on employment, and want to increase investment into the country by making the situation more favorable. So one of the things that AmChams can do, and we've done this successfully in the past, and get in touch with Stefano, he can give you lots of details. But you know, one of the things that we've done quite effectively in the past is to go outside the tax authorities, go outside, in some cases, even the Ministry of Finance, to talk to the Ministry of the Economy, to talk to the inward investment people, even to talk to the Prime Minister's or President's offices, to talk about the investment angle, because that's very important. And you know, one of the tensions which is going to arise in the next 3, 4, 5 years is between that public anger about people, you know, not paying their fair share, and this absolute imperative need, whether it's to resuscitate industries, you know, already existing, or indeed to help build new industries or to retrain people, that is going to require investment. And some of that investment is, you know, going to have to come from outside of the country. So there's a balance of things you can do. It's basically to broaden out the conversation from we need money now, and here are the people that we can get it from.
Daniel, is it work for you, this kind of answer?
A lot. I took a lot of notes. Yeah.
Can I maybe add something to that? I think I fully agree with everything William said, but I want to give maybe a bit of a macro perspective. I mean, if I want to exaggerate things, you know, companies, of course, want to pay as little taxes as possible, and the government wants to raise as many taxes as possible, as much taxes as possible, because, you know, that's just, you know, the best situation for both of them. So I think it's really about fair taxation, and that depends on the social contract in the country. Every country has different views, and maybe Anders can say something about Sweden. In Sweden, taxes are very high, but they're generally accepted because the quality, the return on the tax money being paid is very high in terms of, you know, social services, infrastructure, and so countries have different preferences. In the US, people like low taxes, and they also seem to accept that public services are far inferior than you would have in Sweden, for example. And so it's really about what does society want, right? That's one issue. I think the second issue is also about bailouts. I mean, what we have seen in this crisis is many companies have requested government bailouts. And these are the same countries that have tried to avoid paying taxes in the past or have been paying out dividends, buying their own shares. Take the airline industry in the US. They just received $25 billion US. Last year alone, I think they spent about $9 billion in own shares and dividends that they paid out. And then next year, I'm sure they're going to say they want to pay as least taxes as possible because it's a bad year for them, right? I mean, that doesn't work. I mean, you cannot all the time privatize the profits and then socialize the losses and just let the taxpayer pay for that. Or your employers, because that's another thing that some companies do. So I know of some American companies, but that's not just in the US the case, they give you a fixed dividend. And what happens is if they have a bad year, they just fire people just to make sure the shareholder gets the same dividend every year. I mean, if this kind of policies creates a lot of anger in the population, and I don't think it's sustainable in the long term. It's really about the social contract. So I think I agree with you. Taxation, the government should never abuse its power to tax, but there has to be a discussion within society about, okay, what is a fair level of taxation so that companies can actually develop new activity. We also mentioned job creation. The reality is a lot of companies don't create a lot of jobs. A lot of profit, part of their profit is being reinvested in investment abroad. So you cut taxes in your country so that companies can be more profitable, but then they invest abroad and they create jobs, if they create jobs abroad. So that is one taxpayer is basically subsidizing jobs in another country. Or they invested in digitization, which is not really creating jobs at all. So I think this is a discussion we have to have, and there's no easy answer to that. So it's not black and white. I just want to I want to indicate that it's really a very nuanced discussion we need to have on this issue.
I agree with that.
Okay, can I say something as well? Thank you, William and Anthony. Just to see what you can do from a taxpayer's perspective, I think you put your finger on what is essential due to our knowledge is about fairness and unfairness. For companies to face unfair competition, that makes it really hard to collect taxes. So in order to collect taxes, I mean, people sometimes they don't like to pay taxes, but if it's just and fair, you can deal with it. So it's essential that you give each and every one a fair chance to comply. If that is not the case and you come with enforcement activities, it would be treated as, be seen as this is an unfair use of power from the tax administration. So how can you like an agency that takes people's money? In Sweden, we have worked a lot with understanding fairness from taxpayers' perspective, and especially procedural fairness, how taxpayers perceive that we handle their situation, where important ingredients is about empathy, listening, understanding, that you're not seen by the officials from the agency as an idiot or something like that. So it's very respectful handling. And if taxpayers perceive the procedures as just and fair, they will accept the decision, even if it means paying more taxes. So I think what you point out, that it's about fairness, of course, in the system, but also when it comes to treatment. And this understanding can, of course, be built into digital services and so on, so that you don't focus just on the procedures, but also about the perception, the emotions connected to the procedures. Thank you.
I will add a little bit here what I have learned from the Swedish tax agency by sharing the knowledges with the Moldovan tax administration. Like continuing the idea of Anders, was that at one moment of time we asked them, if you are so digitalized, why don't you put all the relationship between the taxpayer and the tax administration on online? So the level of digitalization in Sweden is quite high. And the question that they addressed me impressed me for a long, long time. They asked me, but why should we? There are a lot of people, about 10% of Swedish, which would not like to have it digital. We should try to understand their needs in interaction with us than our comfort zone in interaction with them. And this is something that at that moment of time impressed me a lot. When I returned home And I use a lot this idea. Anders, am I right in my understanding of your approach?
Yes, you are, and I think it's so easy for agencies to say that, okay, we want people to file electronically, so let's just have a decision that everyone is forced to do that. But then you will end up with other problems like fairness and so on. So I think a trigger for us as tax administration, as I stressed in my presentation, is that we want to use the true potential of digitalization in order to make it good or good for real. And in that sense, we can improve services also for those who don't use digital services today, because we want to understand and listen to them and see why are they not using the possibilities, and then we have the possibility to adapt to that. And when we have had this approach, it has been rather successfully. For example, when it comes to giving third-party information to us, I think we collect 67 million statements from banks and employers and so on. But it's not mandatory. So over 99%, they do it electronically, but we don't force them. And then they think that we're doing something that is actually good for them. So they can say that, well, the tax agency is doing something that helps us when we run our business. And it's exactly the same when it comes to an app that you have on your mobile phone. People say that, okay, this helps me to file, it's good for me. But if on the other hand, we should have the approach that said, you have to do it. You're forced to use this app. Part of the enjoyment and that we do something for them disappears in that moment. So therefore, we think that it's important to not force people, use the true possibilities of digitalization, because it is in society, because people think in the ways that it is good, and those who can't use it because of different things and prefer otherwise, it's okay. They are also part of society, and we can handle that. So I think it's important that we are on our toes and are driven by the right motivation, not oppressing or forcing people this, or instead using the true benefits.
Yep, I agree. like William already said, I agree with that.
Okay, great.
Okay, dear panelists, if you think there is something else that you would like to add, or Dan, or Danielle, or Stefano, do you think we have something? Yeah,
because we discussed a lot about digitalization and technology. We have a short question which for sure has a complicated answer, but maybe you can give just a short view on this about the discussion around the taxation of digital economy. Whether do you think that this crisis will speed up the process, and at some point there will be a decision on this, because we know that for the last years there have been a lot of discussion on the subject, but no clear decision was made. Do you expect that now, given the need for money and the need for finding new ways to raise taxes, this would be finally nailed?
I think William will take this this question definitely.
Okay, so the long answer would take about an hour and a half. I'll try and give you the short one. Look, I mean, the OECD project, which is currently where this is, where the sort of the focus of this conversation is, clearly has some issues. The US does not want its own tech companies to be the sole focus of the project, and to the very highest levels of the US Finance Ministry, the Treasury Department, that has proved to be a sticking point. It's equally clear that a number of other countries would be very happy for this to spread out to all digitalizing companies. So not just, what you would narrowly regard as tech companies or those with the initials which get used. There are, other countries which would prefer to go much beyond that. So there is a disagreement about this. It's a very long-standing disagreement, which goes back to issues around source and residence, or market countries and residence. It's been around for a century. And the other part of the discussion, which is actually not linked to the digital economy at all, is about minimum taxes. And that's primarily an EU issue. And even within the EU, it's primarily a French and German issue.
Yep.
So there's a whole bunch of things which is mixed up in the OECD project. At the same time, as I said, both at the informal ECOFIN over the weekend, at the European Parliament yesterday, in the advisory vote, in Ms. von der Leyen's speech, and Commissioner Thierry Breton's speeches recently, there is a focus on this. So I would expect to see, if the OECD does not come forward with a proposal early in 2021, that the EU will move on this. Now, exactly what it looks like, however, we don't know, because there is the digital services tax, which obviously the EU proposed, which is a tax on gross revenues on certain types of income, platform income, and on social media sites in terms of advertising. That's relatively narrow. However, if you look at the broad range of what could qualify as digitalizing, these could be much larger. There's a disagreement amongst countries as to how broad or narrow that should be. So there are things which need to be worked out there as well. So the short answer is, I would expect in the next year or two to see significant taxes on certain types of digital income. Exactly what shape that takes at the moment, we can't tell. And that's going to be quite important. And to a different question which showed up on the chat before, which is, are there things which could hurt certain countries more than others as we move out of the acute phase into the chronic phase? The answer there potentially is yes, as relates to digital taxes as well. There are some countries which are obviously very well developed in a digital sense, where this is not going to, impede further digitalization. However, there are going to be other countries which are not so far along, where that should be a consideration. So again, that needs to be part of the mix as well. So absolutely yes. I mean, the public pressure on digital taxes, particularly in Europe, is going to be so strong that, and for that matter, to be very clear, many of the rules do need updating because they don't take into account this ability to do business remotely. There is going to be a lot of action in this. What is it going to look like? We don't know. Is all of it going to be, pro-cyclical? Very hard to tell. But yes, this is going to be an area to watch, definitely.
Thank you. Thank you very much, William. By the way, Dan, thank you very much. It was a very nice bridge to our tomorrow's discussion, where we will have a special dedicated panel on digital aspects of taxation. So I don't know if anyone else would like to take the question, or we can smoothly move to our last part of the panel. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Then I will first of all, I will thank you very much, all of you, for absolutely interesting and absorbing discussions and thoughts about. By the way, I intend to go home and to put one more time the registration that we have on YouTube, and to take one more time all your ideas, and maybe put some ideas on a paper in order to remember that. It's absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much for sharing of your thoughts on that, on your knowledges, and I really hope that you will have a chance to participate in Moldova in our second edition in offline mode. See you then.
In person, absolutely.
That would be fantastic.
That would be great.
Yes.
Well,
thank you so much.
Thank you again to you all, and thank you to all the attendees that had the patience to follow us up to now. I remember everybody that we will start again tomorrow 9:30. So please join us in the morning with a discussion about income tax, followed by a second panel of going digital and tax issues, where we will go again into this hot subject about digitalization and technology. So once again, thank you everybody, and enjoy the evening. See you tomorrow morning.
Yeah, but we are still here because we want to say to make some conclusions of today's panels, and we are moving to our CEO. I don't know exactly how it's called in AmCham. Is it okay?
It's okay. Let's go with that.
Okay.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for this panel discussion. Frankly speaking, after 4 hours of presence in the conference, I couldn't take my neither eyes nor ears from what was going on the scene. Thank you, Daniel, for asking such a challenging question, and indeed, it worth listening for the record of the discussion, and I hope I just hope that our colleagues from the Ministry of Finance or from the tax service were not as focused on the part where the tax increases had been justified by our colleagues. So, but in general, that was very, very valuable, your insights and your estimations of what is going to happen in terms of tax policies and macroeconomic trends. That's very important for us in this developing countries neighbor to EU. Of course, you set the tone there, you set the trends, so it's very important what you are doing and what is going to be inspired from what you are doing. Definitely blanket measures can't be afforded in this part of the world, so please keep being creative because we are following you, and then everything that you produce has the impact in this part of the world. Voi continua în română, so thank you very much. I'll continue in Romanian to say bye to all Romanian participants and Moldovan participants. Vă mulțumesc frumos că ați rămas cu noi până la finele lucrărilor conferinței în ziua de astăzi. Vă felicit că ați rezistat, că ați păstrat interesul pentru conținutul pe care l-am plămădit pentru voi. Vreau să sper că veți fi cu noi și mâine, începând cu 9:30. Și eu sunt sigură că și mâine vom avea tot atât de productive discuții și tot atât de captivante. Rămânem aproape și chiar îmi pare rău că nu putem celebra finalizarea acestei prime zile a conferinței cu un pahar de vin, toți împreună, dar asta este realitatea noastră. O acceptăm așa cum este. Vă mulțumesc frumos și ne revedem mâine.
Seara plăcută!